Chapter 326. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of a mechanism turning suddenly sounded in her ears. Suli stopped and frowned to listen, but found that the sound came from her body. She had reincarnated, and there should be nothing left in her body. How could there be such a strange sound? Suli couldn't be careless when she re-practiced. To be cautious, she didn't practice AO sword skills again, but sat down by the bed and quietly looked for the source of the sound in her body. After sensing for a moment, Suli seemed to have gained something. She raised her right hand and naturally began to run a secret method that she had never learned. Then, a black quaint ring finally emerged on the surface of her skin, and the black lotus on it was rotating slowly. The sound came from here. Suli's immature face showed contemplation, which was completely inconsistent with her age. She couldn't understand. In the illusion, Black Lotus Ring had no other effect except sticking to her. Why did it move so frequently after she was inexplicably reincarnated? Was it because her bloodline had reached a certain standard under the influence of Black Lotus Ring? Since she couldn't figure it out, Suli didn't think too much. After waiting patiently for a while, Black Lotus Ring finally stopped rotating. At the same time, Suli's expression also changed subtly. She actually sensed a spirit from Black Lotus Ring that was so small that it was almost undetectable. Device spirit? Did this Black Lotus Ring also have a device spirit, like the reincarnation mirror? Suli looked a little colder. Her experience in the reincarnation mirror made her have no good impression on these device spirits. At this moment, the device spirit of Black Lotus sent a wave with great difficulty. It seemed that because it was too weak, the wave was intermittent. After Suli received all of it, she understood it, and her eyes became clear. The Ghost Clan regarded Black Lotus as a sacred object. In their view, the Dark Lotus symbolized their clan walking in the dark. Any existence that tried to insult the Black Lotus would be hated by the Ghost Clan. This Black Lotus Ring was naturally the sacred treasure of the Ghost Clan. Suli thought it funny. What was Qi Xianqing thinking? He gave a sacred treasure of the Ghost Clan to her, a human clan, for safekeeping? And now, she actually had some kind of inseparable connection with the Black Lotus Ring? Was there anything more ridiculous in this world? Even with her experience as the holy girl of Yushu sect, she felt it was incredible. Perhaps I'm not a pure human in this life. This thought flashed through Suli's mind. She thought of the strange effect of her blood. Wasn't it the talent of the Ghost Clan that Tantai Feng mentioned? What the Black Lotus Ring spirit sent was not only a simple message, but also a piece of awkward-sounding words that could be tentatively called a pithy formula. She said tentatively because she had never seen such a weird practice method, which completely deviated from common sense. In Suli's understanding, if she started to practice it, there was only a dead end. Perhaps the ghost race's cultivation method was like this? The cultivation method that could be preserved by the sacred object of the Ghost Clan could not be rubbish. Maybe it was a higher cultivation method than AO sword skills. If she really had the body of a ghost, she might be able to cultivate successfully. Suli hesitated for a while. What she worried about was not the difference between human and ghost, but the danger of cultivation. After experiencing so much, she didn't care so much about the boundary between the human clan and the Ghost Clan. Although Tantai Feng repeatedly warned her not to have any relationship with the Ghost Clan, but whether her master Qi Xianqing was sincere to her, she could see it clearly with her own eyes. Taking a deep breath, Suli's eyes were a little more cautious. The Ghost Clan's cultivation method had always been famous for its weirdness, and there must be a lot of danger to practice it. She was only 7 years old in this life, and her physical body had not been tempered. She couldn't stand the toss at all. If this Ghost Clan's cultivation method was really overbearing, she might accidentally lose her life again. After thinking about it again and again, Suli finally sighed and gave up the idea of practicing this nameless Ghost Clan's cultivation method. At this moment, another thought came from Black Lotus Ring. After the thought was sent, the spirit seemed to reach the limit of weakness and soon fell into silence again. Suli could no longer sense any pneuma of it. The content of this thought was more than the last time. Although Suli's soul still maintained the characteristics of sharp sixth senses, it was only the level of ordinary children in terms of strength, so it took a long time to digest it. After a full hour, Suli suddenly opened her eyes, and there was an unconcealable shock and gloominess on her face. The message from the spirit didn't recur, which could be said to be extremely simple, but for Suli, it was not easy to be shocked. The body of evil ghost? She was actually the body of evil ghost that was not tolerated by the natural law in this life. Suli had never heard of the origin of this kind of physique before, but the spirit explained very clearly that her physique could adapt to the cultivation method of the ghost clan or the human clan, and no matter what the nature of the mental method was, she could show extremely strong talent. As long as there was enough energy support, it was not a dream for her to recover to Jindan realm in a short time. But everything had a limit. The physique like Suli, which could be improved without limit, must not be tolerated by the natural law. She was even regarded as a natural enemy by the natural law and was killed by a chess piece. How difficult it was to grow up under the eyes of the natural law. In the ghost clan, the body of evil ghost had always been a taboo. If it was born, it would only be regarded as an ominous person and thrown into the endless void, leaving it to fend for itself. Among the human clan, as long as it was heard that the body of evil ghost appeared, the whole clan would hunt it down until it was annihilated. It could be said that the body of evil ghost was a mouse that everyone wanted to beat. Once it was found, there was no way to survive. After taking a breath, Suli looked slightly pale, and there was a little cold sweat on her forehead. The whole world was her enemy. She was really the enemy of the whole world. For her, who had not yet started to re-practice, the pressure was too great. This lifetime would surely be more difficult than any of the lifetimes she'd experienced. She had to be careful with every single step she took and couldn't give herself away in the slightest. Otherwise, she would be easily crushed by the heaven Tao like an ant. After a long time, when the stooped figure of Huang appeared at the door, Suli spat out a foul breath and restrained all the emotions in her heart, but her face was inevitably a little pale. Seeing her, Huang walked over worriedly, touched Suli's forehead full of cold sweat, and said with concern, "Girl, are you uncomfortable? Tell me, and I will take you to the clinic to have a look." Suli shook her head and forced a smile. "I'm fine, Grandpa. I just had a nightmare." Huang breathed a sigh of relief. It's okay. It was normal for this girl to have nightmares just a few days after her father's death, but in the afternoon, he would go to the clinic in the town to buy some tranquilizer medicine to recuperate for this girl. Thinking in his heart, Huang didn't say much to Suli and turned to make lunch. After Huang left, Suli's dark eyes flashed. She was naturally grateful to Huang. If he didn't mention the name Suli, she didn't know how many years it would take for her to recover her memory. Maybe she would expose her body of evil ghost in a muddle and die again inexplicably. She must repay such a great kindness, but unfortunately, she couldn't do it now. She didn't know whether Huang could wait for the day when she could repay him at his age. Huang quickly made lunch, which was just some simple vegetables and sweet potatoes. Seeing Suli eating with relish, Huang smiled and nodded slightly, and then frowned. This little girl's body was still growing, so she couldn't eat without some nutrition. However, those fish and meat weren't something that he could afford just by growing sweet potatoes. "I heard that the town dock is still short of people. Although I am old, I can move it with the basic mental method I learned in Yushu sect. As for the sweet potato field, I will take care of it in the morning and evening," Huang thought in his heart. After telling Suli to stay at home obediently, he ran away without a trace. Suli naturally didn't care about Huang, and she was no longer in a hurry to restore her cultivation as before. Instead, she closed the door and went out. If she rashly practiced and leaked the energy of evil ghost in her body, she might be noticed immediately and lead to a dead end. In this way, she could only postpone the practice plan. She was still very weak and was not even an ant in front of natural law. If she could arrange a simple tactical matrix to isolate Pneuma, she should be able to completely cover up her Pneuma. But how could she get the materials of the tactical matrix? Suli felt a little headache. The universal currency of the cultivation circle was spiritual stones. She had no spiritual stones at all, and she didn't have enough cultivation to rob. This seemed to be a dead knot. While wandering on the ridge, Suli unconsciously came to the bank of Taishui River. She sat down and put her feet in the water. Looking at the clear river, the fish kept swimming around her little feet. This river could be said to be the lifeline of Tieha village. All the people relied on it for water, food, and drink, so it was also fabricated with all kinds of magic. The little fatty told her that this river had a history of nearly 1,000 years. 1,000 years ago, Taishui River was not only about 6 feet wide as it was now, but a big river with no end in sight. Later, the world suddenly changed, and Taishui River also changed. The originally invisible water became solid, as hard as iron, and felt like a mirror. No one could scoop out a drop of water, and many people starved to death. People all said that the river god was angry and sent many sacrifices every year, but Taishui River still didn't change at all. Later, people living near Taishui River all moved away in order to survive, and the reputation of Taishui River also spread. As time passed, it gradually became a legend. Now, this ordinary river, which had dried up and shrunk like a thin willow and was no bigger than a ditch, was the legendary Taishui River. People in Tieha village naturally didn't believe it. They just took it as a myth and put gold on their faces, by the way. Anyway, it could be related to magic, and mortals would not refuse it. Area. When she was thinking randomly, Suli suddenly heard a familiar voice. She looked up and found it was the little fatty. It seemed that after these 2 days of practice, this brat had already thrown his mother's instructions to the back of his mind. Chapter 327. Suli frowned and didn't want to pay attention to the little fatty. But on second thought, she felt it was inappropriate. Before recovering her memory, she would never refuse any invitation from a playmate. Besides, she had nothing else to do now. Brother, wait for me. Suli got up and jumped to follow him. They quickly left the village along the river and stopped at the foot of a low mountain. Taishui River reached here. The large beasts on the mountain had long been killed by hunters. There were only some small animals left, which were not dangerous. Therefore, people in the village did not prohibit children from playing here. The little fatty carefully observed around and found that there was no one else except Suli. Then he jumped into the river, and the water was just above his ankles. Suli looked at him and felt that he was groping for something in the river. She didn't urge him and turned to look at the nameless low mountain. There was no pharmacist in the village. There should be a lot of medicinal materials in the mountain. After the little fatty left, she might as well go up and have a look. Area. Look. At this time, the little fatty finally straightened up and fished out a palm-sized ring wrapped in mud from the water. Although it looked shabby, the pattern on it was very simple and beautiful. The little fatty laughed extremely happily. The treasure I mentioned is this. Buzz. At the moment when her eyes touched this thing, Suli's face changed dramatically. She jumped into the river without hesitation and grabbed the ring from the little fatty. Her hands trembled slightly, and she put it in the water to wash it. Although the little fatty was a little unhappy, he took out this thing to give to Suli, so he didn't care too much and just watched Suli's movements. The mud slowly faded with the river, revealing the original appearance of the ring. It was like a bracelet engraved with complex patterns, which looked delicate and unique. This thing was exactly the same as the one she had in Yushu sect, except that the middle was transparent and the most important mirror was missing. Only the frame was left. Reincarnation mirror. Reincarnation mirror was broken. Suli frowned tightly and groped for the feeling, but she could no longer sense the existence of any reincarnation illusion. After the illusion was broken, where did the people who had been trapped in it go? Lingli, Fangyuan, Chu Qingning, those relatives and friends who used to be illusory, and her son. Suli suddenly grasped her chest. Her face was faintly pale, and a familiar obsession ignited in her black pupils. She thought she could leave everything and set foot on the road of cultivation. But when the wreckage of Reincarnation Mirror was in front of her, she found she couldn't let it go. Fine. Since that was the case, he might as well put an end to all of this. Suli sighed deeply, and her eyes focused on the ring again. A cold smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, and the sarcasm in her eyes grew stronger. Mirror spirit of Reincarnation Mirror, did you have such a day? Although her soul was about to be broken, the mirror spirit of Su, the mirror spirit, it, area. What's wrong? The little fatty suddenly came over, and his big round face almost occupied Su Li's sight. He said, "If you are in a daze again, it will be dark." Su Li suddenly woke up and put the bracelet on her hand. Her voice was like sweet spring water, clear and sweet. "Thank you, brother. I like the bracelet very much." The little fatty chuckled and whispered, "Let's go back quickly. Hide the bracelet in your sleeve and don't let anyone find it. If my mother finds out that I brought you out to play again, you'll be in trouble." Su Li nodded obediently. Although it was only the frame of reincarnation mirror, if it was leaked to cultivators, it would definitely cause a disturbance. Of course, she would not let that happen. Seeing Su Li agreed, the little fatty was finally relieved. He talked with Su Li for a long time, and then went home contentedly. Su Li glanced at the slightly dim sky and shook her head slightly. It seemed that she couldn't go to the mountain today. She would find something at the foot of the mountain and go back. It was dark soon after she returned home. Seeing that Huang had not come back, Su Li skillfully made a fire to cook and fried the wild vegetables picked from the mountain into a dish. After doing this, the moon was already high. Huang finally came back with a medicine bag in his hand. Seeing the food on the table, Huang was stunned for a moment. Then he quickly put down the medicine bag and walked to Su Li's room. Su Li, who was studying the ring of reincarnation mirror, heard the movement. She quickly looked up and saw Huang's face. She smiled and showed her teeth. "Grandpa, you are back." Seeing the injury on Su Li's hand that had not healed, Huang's eyes were wet, but he held it back and nodded with a smile. "Yes, come out to eat. I also want to taste Li's cooking." Picking up the chopsticks, Huang picked up the wild vegetables and put them in his mouth to taste. He thought it was bitter and embarrassing, but there was a faint sweetness in the delicious taste. His old eyes brightened slightly. He chewed in big mouthfuls and praised inarticulately, "Li, your cooking is much better than mine. I will have good food in the future." "Ha ha ha." Su Li nodded, and her eyes were bright. "As long as you are happy, Grandpa, I will cook for you every day." Good, good, good. A simple dinner was spent in warmth. After washing the dishes, Huang boiled a large bucket of hot water and poured the bought medicine bag into the water. He told Su Li, "I bought some medicine for you, which is good for your body. You should soak in it for at least 2 hours. Do you understand?" Su Li nodded. After Huang left, she looked at the turquoise bathwater with a serious expression. She smelled at least 5 kinds of medicinal materials that had the effect of healing and removing scars. Now she needed these to recover from her injury. But where did Huang get so much money to buy medicine? These medicinal materials were not cheap. Well, it's no use to think too much. When my cultivation is restored, I will repay him. Su Li pursed her lips slightly, took off her clothes and sat in the bathtub. She leaned against the edge of the bathtub and quietly moved her pneuma and blood to speed up the recovery of her injury. The medicinal bathwater became clear at a speed visible to the naked eye. In less than an hour, it became clear water, and the efficacy of the medicine was gone. Most of Su Li's injuries were healed. She was at the age of vigor, so it was much easier to recover from injuries than when she was older. However, because she moved her pneuma and blood to speed up the recovery of her injury, her face became paler. The medicinal materials to replenish pneuma and blood are very precious for warriors. I don't know if there are any more on the short mountain. Sensing the anemia in her body, Su Li's eyes slightly sank. At this moment, the sky full of stars suddenly sprinkled a starlight, which wrapped Su Li in a moment of shock. In an instant, a cool and gentle pneuma completely wrapped her, and a series of bursting sounds came from her thin body. Immediately, Su Li felt that her physical fitness had at least tripled, and the weakness accumulated in 7 years had disappeared. She was no worse than a miss from an ordinary big family. Why does the starlight suddenly come? Su Li was surprised and doubtful. Then an idea flashed in her mind. She raised her right hand, and the quaint bracelet on her wrist was emitting a faint fluorescence. If she didn't look carefully, she couldn't see it at all. Reincarnation mirror can restore itself? Su Li was surprised, but immediately felt it was reasonable. After all, this thing was an ancient treasure. Even if it was broken, it was possible to recover. She looked up at the starry sky with no abnormalities and narrowed her eyes slightly. In this way, even if she didn't practice, her physical body would be constantly tempered by the starlight and become stronger. In her previous life, she suffered a lot in the illusion. In this life, the broken reincarnation mirror became her help. Take it as your compensation for me. Su Li smiled coldly, closed her eyes, and tried to lead the power on the bracelet to continue to temper herself. As expected, a part of the starlight poured into her body, staining her newly born internal organs with a layer of silver ash. Little by little, the impurities were discharged from the body along the pores. Gradually, a sense of emptiness spread from Su Li's body. After a long time, Su Li sensed that the starlight on the bracelet had been consumed by her. Chapter 328. In the blink of an eye, another 7 years passed. Su Li stayed in Tieha village all the time and never went out to see the changes in the outside world. The nimbus in Tieha village was barren, and there was no condition for cultivation at all. However, she pushed her cultivation to the peak of the third hurdle of Lianqi realm in just 3 years with the convenience of the body of evil ghost and the reincarnation mirror. The remaining 4 years were limited by the environment, and her cultivation could not be improved. However, her physical strength reached the peak of Zhuji realm because of the frequent quenching of starlight. Such a strange situation could only be caused by Su Li's special physique. If she could enter a suitable environment for cultivation, her cultivation could easily reach Zhuji realm in a short time. However, as early as 1,000 years ago, the blessed places suitable for cultivation had been divided up by the major cultivation sections. Even the places with poor nimbus were occupied by small sections. If she wanted to restore her cultivation, she must join a sect. Holding the literacy book in her hand, Su Li's eyes flickered. It was possible to expose her identity if she contacted the practitioners. But if she didn't contact them, she was likely to be trapped in the third hurdle of Lianqi realm for the rest of her life. The gap between the third hurdle of Lianqi realm and the ninth hurdle of Jindan realm in her previous life was as huge as that between fireflies and the bright moon. In this vast and boundless Qingshui circle, the practitioners in Jindan realm could barely survive. Even in Yushu sect, there were at least 10 people who could kill her. So, if a casual practitioner in the third hurdle of Lianqi realm walked in the cultivation circle, he had to be careful even when breathing. If he was unlucky, he might be trampled to death by a powerful practitioner. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. She couldn't enter the sect deliberately. She needed an opportunity, and she waited for 4 years. But even so, she remained patient. If she wanted to know what happened in the past, she must step into the cultivation circle. The only difference was whether she was active or passive. If she was passive, it would be more natural and less likely to be exposed. But if there was no opportunity, she could only take the risk to contact the cultivation circle. So, she set a deadline for herself, which was 10 years. Now there were 3 years left. Bang! The wooden ruler hit the table very loudly. The well-dressed teacher looked serious, and his old eyes faintly showed disgust. He scolded, "Su Li." Su Li changed her mind and slowly raised her head. When her eyes met the teacher's, she was already at a loss. Her expression immediately caused a burst of laughter in the school. The teacher was gloomy. He came over and patted Su Li's desk. "Give me your hand." Su Li sighed in her heart and stretched out her hand obediently. Pa! The wooden ruler hit her palm hard. Although Su Li didn't feel much pain, she still cooperated and showed an aggrieved expression. "No one has ever dared to not listen to my lessons. You are the first. Yesterday, I told you that if you don't listen to my lessons, don't ever think about listening to my lessons again. Now, get out of here." Pa! When the last foot fell, Su Li's palms were red. She didn't refute anything and obediently put away the book and walked out of the door. Her experience was so profound that she didn't need to learn much even in a cultivation sect, let alone a mortal school. But Huang didn't know that and insisted on spending the money. So, Su Li could only let him arrange it. As for telling him the truth, Su Li never thought about it. Her identity was too sensitive, and it would only hurt Huang. After the class in the evening, A scholar in blue hurried from another schoolyard. When he saw Suli standing at the door of the school and hadn't left, his eyes immediately brightened. He walked quickly to Suli and said with a smile, "Sister Suli, let's go back to the village together?" Suli looked up at him and said, "Aren't you afraid of your mother's blame?" The face of the scholar in blue could still see the outline of the little fat boy, but now he was not fat and had a very formal name, Yang Chuanbua. Speaking of which, Yang Chuanbua learned how to be a hunter under the guidance of his father since he was a child. He should have no opportunity to go to the school in the town. But Yang Chuanbua's third uncle became the mayor of the town, and the family's wealth rose greatly. Naturally, he didn't have to run around for survival. Yang Chuanbua's parents thought about it and felt that if he studied, he might be able to take over his third uncle's position in the future. After all, his third uncle was a loner and had no children. The only person he was close to was Yang Chuanbua. As for why Suli came to school, needless to say, Huang's obsession to make Suli stand out was stronger than anyone else. Even if the school tuition was very high, he still gritted his teeth and supported it. To Huang's surprise, he worked hard every day, but he didn't get sick. Instead, he became healthier, which really puzzled him. He couldn't find the answer. Over time, he no longer struggled and was happy to go on like this. Yang Chuanbua smiled bitterly and said, "We are the only two students in this town, and now you have become beautiful. Even if my mother sees you, she won't blame you." Yang Chuanbua, on the other hand, was still as honest as before. Everything he said was straightforward and without any scheming. Suli touched the corner of her eyes. Starlight had been refining her body for 7 years, and the scars on her face had long disappeared. Only a small lotus mark in the corner of her eye, which was only the size of a broad bean, was left. It didn't affect her face, but added a little brightness. Huang and the villagers all thought it was a scar left when she was a child. Only she knew in her heart that it must have something to do with Black Lotus Ring. "If you are not afraid of being scolded, you can follow me," Suli said and walked ahead. Yang Chuanbua immediately smiled and followed her. As the saying goes, a girl changes 18 times between childhood and womanhood. He still remembered that when Arya was a child, there were many scars on her face. She was the ugliest of all the little girls in the village. But after only 7 years, after the scars on Su Li's face faded, she became extremely beautiful and lively. She became the most beautiful girl in the village. At the age of 14, it was almost the age to talk about marriage. Now his family was the best in the whole village. Naturally, he wanted to marry Suli. Moreover, he didn't listen to his mother when he was a child and treated Suli very well. He must have left a good impression on Suli, so he had a greater chance to marry her. This caused him and his mother to rejoice. Yang Chuanbua was still thinking. He unconsciously walked through the mountain road, and Tieha village was already in sight. Suli stood on the edge of the mountain road and looked down. Smoke had been rising from the roofs of households. Suddenly, she narrowed her eyes and looked to the right. There were 2 smokes, which were completely different from the smoke, coming straight through. Amidst the mist, a young man and a young woman dressed in green and red sword robes rode on the cloud-like magic treasures beneath their feet, flying neither too fast nor too slow. Amidst the lingering clouds and mist, they emitted an otherworldly aura. They were both dragons and phoenixes among men, outstanding and extraordinary. First senior fellow apprentice. The dignified woman in a red sword robe with a soft sword tied to her waist suddenly complained, "Marshal Uncle Yuan is clearly using his position to avenge his personal grievances. He asked us to come to such a barren place to find children with immortal latency. What an idiot." The calm face of the young man, who seemed to be 2 years older than the woman, was a little gloomy. He frowned slightly, but said, "Junior sister apprentice, don't talk about the elders. Since Marshal Uncle ordered us to do so, he must have his reasons." "What bullshit reason?" The woman suddenly got angry, and the dignity she struggled to maintain disappeared. She became shrewish and scolded. "Yuan Shu is a villain. Originally, with our cultivation, we should be assigned to a 2nd grade area, or at least a 3rd grade area. But now, first senior fellow apprentice, we have been assigned to a 5th grade area without Nimbus. It's impossible for such a barren place to have children with immortal latency. The young man fell silent, for the junior sister apprentice spoke his mind. Both of them were from a small cultivation sect, Huajian sect. 1,000 years ago, Huajian sect was still an affiliated sect of Yushu sect, the largest sect in Zhezhou region. It had been prosperous for a time because of the mountain behind it. After the bloody accident of Samsara that shocked the cultivation circle, Yushu sect suffered a great loss, and Huajian sect was not spared. 90% of the talented disciples in the sect died, and the talents withered. There was a shortage of young people. In desperation, the head of the sect had to lower the threshold for accepting disciples and carry out a great reform. In the past, there was an iron rule for accepting disciples in the cultivation sections. Talent was the most important, and temperament was the second. Only those with a complete spiritual root were qualified to be trained by the sect and step into the path of cultivation. After the reform, the disciples of Huajian sect were no longer limited to those with spiritual roots. As long as they had a little bit of affinity with cultivation, they would be accepted and trained. This kind of disciples were also called children with immortal latency. Such behavior naturally made the disciples with spiritual root, who were originally superior, dissatisfied. Even the elders of the sect felt that it was absurd and a joke. Huajian sect was in chaos for hundreds of years. It was not until a genius child with immortal latency was born that the method of recruiting children with immortal latency was finally recognized. Even if a lot of cultivation resources were wasted, it was not a loss if 1 in 1,000 children with immortal latency could cultivate to Zhuji realm. What's more, that genius was far beyond Zhuji realm. Now 1,000 years had passed. Although Huajian sect was still a weak sect, it was much stronger than in the past. The young man dispelled these distracting thoughts and stopped thinking about these trivial things. Every 10 years, the sect would send 50 inherited disciples to travel for a year to recruit disciples. Each disciple would bring back no less than 2 children with immortal latency, and the more the better. This year, his brother and sister were also among them. Unfortunately, Uncle Master Yuan was in the way. It was really difficult for the two of them to bring back 4 children with celestial latency within a year. However, if they returned empty-handed, their cultivation resources would definitely be reduced. Therefore, when they left the sect, junior sister was already calculating in her heart that if she really couldn't find a suitable candidate, then she would just bring back 4 boys that she found pleasing to the eye. In any case, immortal fate was just a saying. Whether they were fated or not, it all depended on the two of them. Originally, he was not willing to deceive the master and the senior masters, but the 1-year period was coming. The young man's eyes darkened slightly. Yuan Shu, it's your fault. Don't blame me. Chapter 329. Senior fellow apprentice, there is a village here. Let's go down and have a look. The junior sister apprentice in red saw the smoke of Tieha village and asked. The young man nodded slightly. Suddenly, he felt someone was peeping at him and immediately turned his head to look at the direction of the gaze. It turned out that 2 teenagers happened to see the cloud. The young man breathed a sigh of relief and didn't care anymore. Senior fellow apprentice, what's wrong with you? The young man shook his head and landed in the middle of Tieha village. This scene was immediately seen by many villagers of Tieha village. For a time, the village was shocked and a large group of people ran to the direction where the cloud landed. Sister Suli, look, the cloud fell from the sky. Yang Chuanbua, who also saw this change, exclaimed, let's go and have a look. Then, he quickened his pace. Suli narrowed her eyes and followed him. When they walked to the entrance of the village, they happened to meet a beautifully dressed girl who had just come out of the village head's home. When she saw Yang Chuanbua, her beautiful eyes suddenly brightened. Then, she saw Suli beside Yang Chuanbua. A trace of jealousy flashed on her delicate face, but she quickly recovered and greeted them in a crisp voice. Brother Chuanbua. Yang Chuanbua turned his head and saw the girl. He couldn't help but smile and called, Huan Huan. Hearing Yang Chuanbua's intimate address, Liu Huan was slightly happy and nodded repeatedly. I saw Grandpa and Aunt go there. Let's go. Then, she didn't wait for Yang Chuanbua to continue to say anything. She stepped forward to occupy Su Li's position and pushed his back to walk away. Feeling the warm and soft little hand behind him, Yang Chuanbua couldn't help walking and felt uncomfortable. He hurriedly said, "Men and women shouldn't touch each other. Huan Huan, you have grown up. This is not appropriate." Li Yuehuan rolled her eyes and pouted. "What's inappropriate? Brother Chuanbua, let's go. If we are late, we won't be able to see anything." Yang Chuanbua had no choice but to sigh secretly and follow Li Yuehuan's intention. The old village head was very prestigious in the town. He didn't want to offend the Li family and cause his uncle to look down on him. Seeing that Yang Chuanbua finally obeyed, Li Yuehuan's face was a little proud. Then, she didn't forget to show off to Su Li, who followed behind and said silently, "You can never compete with me." Seeing this, Su Li couldn't help but feel speechless. She had lived for more than 1,000 years, and her temperament had long been tempered like iron and stone. There was no way she would stoop to the level of a 13-year-old Li Yuehuan. In this village, the only one who had some karma with her was Huang. She raised her head and looked over Li and Yang, falling on the place surrounded by a group of Tieha villagers not far away. There were 2 auras there, brilliant like lights in the dark night. Perhaps it was because this place was remote and it was impossible to meet people of the same Tao, or perhaps it was to intimidate mortals, but the 2 of them did not restrain their auras at all. Early-stage foundation establishment, and 2 of them. Su Li was slightly shocked, and a touch of caution appeared at the bottom of her eyes, but she was not nervous. With such a low cultivation, it was impossible for him to come for her. Even so, with her recovered strength, she could kill the 2 of them with one move. Li Yuehuan saw that Su Li was not angry at all, but completely ignored her. She was very upset, but in front of Yang Chuanbua, she would not show her unruly side. She could only hold back her anger and wait to settle accounts later. At this moment, by the Taishui River, a group of villagers saw the 2 figures of a young man and a young woman after the clouds dispersed. They were all stunned, and then they began to point and whisper. The woman, who was treated like this for the first time in front of mortals, suddenly frowned and was angry. She was about to scold and frighten them, but was stopped by the young man, who shook his head and said, "It seems that this is a very rare barbarian land. Don't bother with them." The woman suddenly realized that the so-called barbarian land was the land of mortals who still didn't know what cultivation was. This place was really not ordinary and remote. "Barbarian? Who are you scolding, you little boy?" The young man did not transmit the sound, but his words were certainly heard by the villagers, which immediately aroused the anger of a group of people, and they were about to step forward to teach the young man a lesson. The young man frowned slightly, trouble. Although he acted calmly and reasonably, a cultivator was not a kind person, and killing 1 or 2 mortals was no burden for him. But at this moment, someone shouted, "The old village head is here." The young man's movement paused slightly, and then he saw a white-haired old man on crutches trembling in front of him, saluting and saying, "You 2 look extraordinary, so you must be of noble origin. May I ask why you come to my Tieha village?" The woman in red snorted coldly and said in a sweet voice, "We are inherited disciples of Huajian sect, an immortal cultivation sect." Immortal cultivation sect? Huajian sect? The old village head was at a loss. The woman's words were like playing the lute to a cow. Su Li, who was standing in the crowd, blinked her eyes slightly. She had some impression of this sect. She didn't know if the current head of Huajian sect was still the immortal Hua Yin, who was obsessed with flowers and started cultivation with flowers. What immortal cultivation? Are there really immortals in this world? Don't tell me these 2 are. While people were whispering, they thought of the way the 2 people came, and their faces changed with fear. If they were really immortals, didn't they just offend immortals? My junior sister apprentice and I will pick 2 each and send them to the sect to seek immortality in Taoism. The old village head was stunned when he heard it. "Do you mean that the children in their village will become immortals like you in the future?" The woman smiled proudly and interrupted, "Of course. My senior fellow apprentice is the 3rd inherited disciple. How can he lie? Hurry up." As soon as the words came out, all the people who had children at home showed great joy on their faces. Without the old village head's order, they all went home to call their children. Even the man whose arm was cut off ran quickly. This was a chance to become an immortal, and no mortal didn't want to become an immortal. The woman showed a little pride as a cultivator on her face, but the young man who was used to this scene didn't change his expression. His eyes fell on the children who stayed here with a trace of yearning. Almost at a glance, the young man saw Su Li. Although she had the black lotus ring to cover the traces of cultivation, her appearance after cultivation was naturally much more flexible than that of ordinary mortals. Coupled with the lotus-shaped mark at the corner of her eyebrows, she was quite outstanding among the many peasant children. Lotus birthmark? This woman is destined to be in Huajian sect. I have an explanation even in front of senior uncle. Thinking of this, the young man showed a trace of gentleness on his face. He waved to Su Li and said slowly, "You, come to me." Huang followed the gaze and was not surprised to see Su Li, but he inevitably felt a trace of bitterness in his heart. If Su Li entered the sect, he was afraid that he would never have a chance to see her again in this life. Su Li was slightly vigilant, but she looked innocent and ignorant on the surface. She walked to the young man obediently. When the young man saw the book bag on her back, his eyes became more gentle and he smiled. "It's better that you can read. It's easier to teach. What's your name? Whose child are you?" In the face of the young man's question, Su Li did not answer, but turned her head and looked at Huang. Chapter 330. Although Su Li's movement seemed quite weak, it was disguised by her age. In the eyes of the young man, it was ignorant of the world, and he didn't blame her. He followed Su Li's gaze and looked at Huang. Then he looked more relaxed. "Is she your granddaughter?" Cold sweat appeared on Huang's forehead. He bowed his head and said respectfully, "Immortal." Arya was from the Su family in the east of the village. After her father died, she was lonely, so I took her in as a companion. It has been 7 years now. When the young man heard this, he was more interested. In this way, after Huang died, Su Li would have no worries in the secular world and would not be involved in the mortal world. She would have an excellent immortal fate. It would be no trouble for him to send her to the sect. "Well, I already know that your granddaughter is indeed destined to be an immortal. I will take her back to the sect and train her carefully as one of my selected children with immortal fate." When the young man said this, he frowned. He didn't want to ask Su Li's name for the second time. Huang gritted his teeth and said, "Immortal, please forgive me." At that time, Arya didn't have a formal name. I didn't know much, so I boldly used the name of a big shot to change her fate. Now I can't say this name in front of you. "Oh?" The young man raised his eyebrows, and the woman in red couldn't help but laugh at Su Li, who was cautious. "A big shot? Old guy, the big shot in your eyes may be less than an ant in our eyes." Huang smiled bitterly, opened his mouth, and hesitated. "Arya's name is..." Seeing that he was still hesitating, the woman in red immediately became impatient. Liu Huan, who was standing next to Yang Chuanbua, seemed to realize that this was a good opportunity to stop Su Li from seeking immortality. She immediately shouted, "Su Li!" Her name is Su Li, which means Linley. As soon as the words came out, the young man and the woman in red changed their faces. "This name, wasn't it the one in Yushu sect, senior brother? We can't bring him back to the sect." The woman in red raised her eyebrows and immediately opened her mouth to stop him. "Don't forget the relationship between the sect leader and Su and that person. If she finds out that a mortal dares to use this name and is brought into the sect to cultivate, she will definitely be furious. Perhaps even we will be implicated." After the red-clothed woman finished speaking, her face suddenly became a lot uglier. She had just said those words. If others were to know that she called that person an ant, wouldn't that mean? Thinking of this, the woman in red lifted her head and her gaze shot towards Liu Huan like lightning. Liu Huan had never experienced such a sharp gaze before. She was so frightened that her face turned pale. Her body softened, and she leaned against Yang Chuanbua's chest. But she was secretly delighted. She didn't expect that saying Su Li's name would really make her lose the chance to become an immortal. In this way, wouldn't his chances be even greater? Yang Chuanbua was at a loss of what to do. He looked at the old village head for help, But the old village head seemed not to see it. He stood aside like an old man and dared not to cross the line. The young man stood aside and frowned. Obviously, he was hesitant because of what his junior sister apprentice said. At this time, the villagers of Tieha village arrived with their children. The young man was slightly refreshed. He temporarily put Su Li's matter aside and carefully selected the children. The woman in red also temporarily withdrew her gaze and selected with her senior fellow apprentice. The test of spiritual root could only be carried out in the sect. For the two of them who went out to recruit disciples for the sect, it seemed that they could only choose from the appearance. Whoever was pleasing to the eye would get the opportunity to soar to the sky. Su Li quietly watched the two of them exclude the ordinary-looking children. Looking at the resentment and disappointment on the faces of the children's parents, a ripple appeared in her heart. There was no fairness in the world. People were born unequal. Some people were born as the sons of the sect leader with noble status and endless practice resources, while some people were born in poor families. They might not have a good end even if they worked hard all their lives. So some people said that they should accept their fate. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. Over the years, she intermittently learned what happened 1,000 years ago from Huang. Although there were many vague parts, she also speculated a lot of things. The broken mirror must have something to do with the old beggar. The number of practitioners who died because of the broken mirror was more than 100,000, which was far more than the number of talents from the Jiuzhou region who entered that year. She remembered that there were no more than 1,000 sect geniuses who entered the reincarnation mirror at the same time as her. But the number she heard now was 100 times larger. Other regions also participated, even the entire Qingshui circle. Su Li's eyes flashed with light. This conclusion was not difficult to guess, because no matter Lingli, Fang Yuan, or even Chu Qingning, they were not from the Jiuzhou region. Otherwise, it was impossible for her not to have any impression. For the entire Qingshui circle, her death seemed insignificant, and even Yushu sect was just a pawn. Opening the reincarnation mirror and then dying, that was her fate. All kinds of complex thoughts came to her mind. Suddenly, Su Li had another idea. As soon as this idea appeared, it lingered in her heart like a maggot attached to the bone and could not be dispersed. Although the reincarnation mirror was an ancient treasure of heaven and earth, she was the only one who was inherited the secret method to open it after all. Even the old beggar and others once said that she was half the owner of the reincarnation mirror. If she hadn't opened the reincarnation mirror for Yushu sect, she might have been a powerful person in the world now. Even with the help of the reincarnation mirror, she might have become one of the giants with the right to speak in Qingshui circle. But in the end, she still couldn't let go of her master and the sect she had stayed in for 900 years. So, she resolutely opened the door of the reincarnation mirror with her body as the foundation. One wrong step, and the whole game was lost. She took a step, which was like sending a plate of fish to a group of robbers. From then on, she became the fish on the chopping board, which was eroded by all forces in Qingshui circle. They sent countless pawns to plunder everything that should belong to her. Would Lingli and Fang Yuan also be the pawns deliberately arranged by those chess masters? Su Li's hands hidden in her sleeves slowly clenched. Her lips were pale, and her eyes were dim. Finally, she suddenly relaxed. She didn't want to think about the answer to the question. When she recultivated to a certain realm, all the truth would be revealed naturally. By then, maybe she would be ready to accept cruelty. When she came to herself for a moment, the two people of Huajian sect finally looked at the qualified children of dozens of families in Tia village. Finally, the young man chose Yang Chuanbua who had red books, and the other candidate was hesitant. The woman in red chose two boys who looked quite smart, and didn't even look at Li Yuehuan who was full of longing. She didn't like to take jealous boys with her. The young man glanced at Su Li who bowed her head and didn't know what she was thinking. He moved his eyes away and finally fell on Li Yuehuan. The latter immediately tensed up and nervously tidied the broken hair around her ears. There was a trace of fear in her panic. Her appearance was really pitiful, which made other teenagers in the village swallow their saliva secretly. However, the young man's face turned cold. He had climbed all the way from an outer court disciple to the position of a true inheriting disciple, and along the way, there had been countless female cultivators who wanted to climb into his bed. Li Yuehuan's expression was exactly the same as those cheap women, and just looking at her made him want to vomit. The young man sighed secretly and finally looked back to Su Li. If he hadn't met Su Li, he wouldn't have had such a high requirement for selecting the child with immortal latency. But it was like tasting delicious food. Once the most delicious food was placed in the front, other food would become bland and tasteless. Well, it's a little troublesome, and it may not even be troublesome. The young man pondered in his heart and finally waved to Su Li and said, "Come here and leave with me." Su Li was slightly stunned. She didn't expect that the young man still chose her after hearing her name. Although she felt strange in her heart, she still walked to the young man obediently and bowed her head in silence. "Senior fellow apprentice." The woman in red suddenly became anxious, but before she spoke, she was interrupted by the young man who waved his hand and said, "It's okay. I know what to do." Then he turned his head and asked, "Su Li, your name is troublesome, so I will give you a new name. Would you like to?" Su Li suddenly understood. It turned out that this was his idea. Huang's eyes brightened when he heard the words, and his intuition told him that this method was very good. But seeing that Su Li didn't respond, he suddenly became anxious and urged in a low voice, "Li, agree." Although he might never see Su Li again in this life after she entered the sect, as a grandfather who didn't want his granddaughter to have a better future, Su Li heard the concern and eagerness in Huang's words, and her heart was slightly warmed. She raised her head and nodded, "Immortal, please give me a name." In such a situation, there was no room for her to refuse. If she really refused, it was likely that she would not be able to enter the sect, and if the young man was a little narrow-minded, he might kill her at will. At that time, she would have to show her real cultivation to resist. Even if she was killed, it would definitely attract the attention of Huajian sect, and then enter the side of Yushu sect and even more people. She couldn't bear such consequences now. Of course, the young man didn't know that Su Li had thought so much in just a few breaths, and he didn't know that he was on the verge of death. He saw Su Li's well-behaved appearance and the pure pneuma she exuded, which made him feel very comfortable. A faint smile inadvertently appeared on the corner of his mouth. "That's good. Since you are willing, I must give you a good name. On the way back to the sect, I will think about it and tell you. If you succeed in your cultivation in the future, it is okay to change back to the original name." "Thank you, Immortal." Su Li saluted respectfully, but she knew that the second half of the young man's words was completely polite. If she changed her name without the young man's cultivation, it would inevitably cause the young man's displeasure. Chapter 331. Stimulated by the two, the cloud flew extremely fast. Half a day passed in the blink of an eye. Except for Su Li, the fear and reluctance of Yang Chuanbua and others faded away, leaving only excitement and novelty. However, with the deterrence of the young man, they didn't dare to speak carelessly. Su Li glanced at the young man who was concentrating on flying, and her expression was indifferent. Before leaving, Huang took her hand and said a lot of things to her. "Girl, you have to remember that the cultivation sect is not a good place. When I was in Yushu sect, I saw many handyman disciples die violently, and even the official disciples of Ymen branch lived carefully for fear of losing their lives. After entering the sect, remember to be careful in everything, and don't act rashly to offend others. You are a sensible girl, alas." It could be seen that Huang was very worried about her, and there were many things he didn't tell her, but there was no time for him to nag. Su Li didn't promise Huang. Although going to Huajian sect was within her control, everything in the world was variable. Even if she was reborn in the illusion, she couldn't protect herself, let alone now. After a while, Su Li raised her head and looked at the mountain not far below the cloud like Yang Chuanbua and others. There, she could vaguely see a sense of familiarity. The mountain gate of Huajian sect should be here. Sure enough, soon after, the young man and the woman controlled the magic weapons to descend at the same time. After passing through a cloud of miasma, a mountain surrounded by clouds and mist came into view, which was completely different from the frozen world outside. The mountain peaks were like spring all year round, with birds singing and fragrant flowers, like a paradise isolated from the world. Occasionally, white cranes could be seen flying up from the mountain peaks in a graceful posture, like a fairyland. Several children widened their eyes and exclaimed in surprise, "What a beautiful place! Is this the place where immortals live?" Yang Chuanbua opened his mouth wide. At a young age, he never thought that there would be such beautiful mountains and rivers in the world. Su Li also pretended to be inexperienced on the surface, but she was secretly awestruck. When she passed through the miasma just now, she clearly felt that the second layer of the mountain-guarding matrix of Huajian sect was opened. At that time, she was the holy girl of Yushu sect, relying not only on her strong cultivation and combat capability, but also on the realm of tactical matrix master. Huayin wanted to establish her own sect. As her best friend, she gave her the triple star-stacked mountain-guarding matrix as a congratulatory gift. As its name suggested, the matrix was divided into 3 layers. The first layer only activated the illusory array and the low-level defensive array, which could be maintained by consuming the lowest grade of low-grade spirit stones. The second layer activated the illusory array, defensive array, and a part of the killing array at the same time, which required the consumption of low-grade spirit stones. It could only be activated when the sect was in danger. As for the third layer, it needed precious upper-grade spiritual stones to increase the power of the tactical matrix. Huajian sect was a small sect. Not to mention upper-grade spiritual stones, even the reserves of middle-grade spiritual stones were not enough. If the third layer of the tactical matrix was really opened, Huajian sect would not be far from being destroyed. Now Huajian sect looked very peaceful, and they even had the leisure to go out to look for new disciples. Why would they open the second tactical matrix? Su Li's heart was full of doubts, but this question was obviously not what she could ask. She could only put it in her heart and explore it later. Not long after, the young man and the woman led Su Li and others to an open space on the top of a mountain. Someone on the mountain saw them and hurried over immediately. Taking advantage of this time, the young man explained, "There are 4 peaks in Huajian sect. Among them, Baihua Peak is the residence of the headmaster, and there are not many disciples there. Among the other 3 peaks, Fujian Peak and Danxia Peak are for the disciples of Neiman Branch. All the disciples of Neiman Branch stay in Qinghua Peak. This is Qinghua Peak." Then he looked at Su Li and said, "From now on, your name will be Su Yu." Su Li was slightly stunned. After thinking of the figure in the reincarnation mirror, she nodded. She didn't dislike this name. The real Su Yu should also live well in Qingshui Circle. If there was a chance in the future, she could see her. Hearing the young man's words, the woman smiled slightly and thought to herself, "Romantic, Hua, Shueyue, senior fellow apprentice Han Feng has 2 maids named Hua and Shui respectively. That's probably how the word you came about. It's really casual." While they were talking, 2 middle-aged men in cyan standard robes had arrived quickly. Under the astonished gaze of Yang Chuanbua and others, they respectfully saluted to the young man and the woman, "Greetings, Senior Uncle Han and Senior Uncle Ruan." Han Feng nodded slightly and glanced at the surprised children, but didn't explain. He told the middle-aged man in cyan, "Take them to the testing stone, and I will come later." Then, Han Feng and the woman surnamed Ruan floated away under the envious gaze of the middle-aged man in cyan. After a long time, the middle-aged man in cyan, who looked older, withdrew his gaze and looked indifferent again. He said, "Come with me. You may have many questions in your mind, but it doesn't matter. As long as you stay in the sect for a while, you will understand everything. Now, come with me." Hearing this, Yang Chuanbua and others didn't dare to act rashly and hurriedly followed him. Even if she wanted to recultivate quietly, it would be very difficult. Suddenly, there was a commotion among the children. Su Li looked in the direction of the loudest voice. It turned out that there were 2 more children, a boy and a girl, who were dressed in well-tailored golden clothes. They behaved with nobility, as if they were princes and princesses from the royal family, which made all the other children present feel ashamed. The boy in golden clothes looked proud and glanced at the audience. There was a sneer on his childish and fair face. He was different from these lowly and poor people, But his father asked him to test the spiritual root in the same place with this group of garbage. It was disgusting. All right, I'll see you off here. Don't let me down. The woman who brought her tongs said indifferently, and the boy in golden clothes restrained his arrogance and saluted. Thank you, First Senior Sister Apprentice. First Senior Sister Apprentice? Hearing this title, the woman slightly twitched the corner of her mouth. She didn't say anything and turned away. Shortly after she left, many children suddenly surrounded the boy in golden clothes. Forming cliques in order to survive was something that started from the moment they entered the sect. Shall we go there too? In the small group of Tieha village, one of the two boys couldn't help but ask. Suli vaguely remembered that his name was Chun Hu. The other boy, Wang Xiai, immediately looked at Yang Chuanbua. Yang Chuanbua hesitated and glanced at Suli, who was unmoved. In the end, he sighed and didn't take any action. If you don't go, I will. Chun Hu looked at the golden-robed boy, and yearning flashed in his eyes. He then tugged at Wang Xiai, who was beside him. Wang Xiai looked like he was in a difficult position, but when he saw more and more people around the golden-robed boy, he couldn't help but leave with Chan Hu. Area? Yang Chuanbua was slightly anxious, but because he couldn't let go of Suli, he didn't follow them. Suli sighed secretly. For the sake of the ring of reincarnation mirror, she said, wait a little longer. It's too early to choose now. Hearing Suli's words, Yang Chuanbua suddenly froze and immediately looked at Suli with confusion and doubt. Sister Area seemed to be a little different, but he had too little knowledge. Except for the word different, he couldn't say a specific word to describe it. He just felt that he should listen to Suli. At this moment, a loud shout suddenly burst over the field. Like a thunder. What are you doing? A group of children crowded together were immediately frightened and in a mess. Many children were trampled and injured. Chapter 332. When the green-robed stewards heard this, their expressions changed. Without saying a word, they rushed down to save several severely injured children who were about to be trampled to death. Among them was Chun Hu. At this moment, his face was covered in blood and he was crying loudly. Even if he could survive, his face would be disfigured. Wang Xiai was also slightly injured, but he was much better than Chun Hu. Yang Chuanbua looked at this scene with lingering fear. Fortunately, he listened to Suli and didn't go over. Otherwise, he would probably end up like Chun Hu. Thinking of this, he subconsciously glanced at Suli beside him, but found that the latter saw such a bloody scene without any change of expression on her face. Yang Chuanbua became more and more confused. Was this still the sister Suli he knew before, who didn't even dare to kill a chicken? Right at this moment, the black-robed old man finally descended from the sky. With a sweep of his sharp gaze, all the children were immediately intimidated, and in an instant, there was absolute silence. The elder coughed slightly and said loudly, "Little kids, I am the elder of Wymin branch. I am responsible for testing your spiritual roots. Now come over and line up for the test one by one. Inku, watch carefully. If anyone dares to make a ruckus, kick him out of the sect." Yes. The middle-aged man in cyan clothes who had brought Suli and others to the open space stepped forward and responded. Then he arranged the line in an orderly manner with many stewards behind him. Yang Chuanbua and Suli lined up in the middle. Suli looked around the line and saw at a glance that the boy in gold clothes was at the front of the line. But at this moment, the boy in gold clothes was a little disheveled and looked quite embarrassed. He was almost injured in the chaos just now. On the contrary, the girl in gold clothes was still the same. Her eyes were timid, and she didn't have the arrogance of the boy in gold clothes. The black-clothed elder walked to the front of the stone tablet and pressed his palm on the stone surface. The whole stone surface suddenly lit up slightly and then dimmed down. Seeing this, he nodded and turned back indifferently. "The first one, come to my side." The boy in gold clothes looked a little respectful, but not nervous. The royal family he was born in had some connection with cultivation, so it was not difficult to find a low-grade spiritual stone for testing in advance. Place your hand on the stone tablet, empty your mind, and feel it with all your heart. Under the guidance of the black-robed elder, The golden-robed boy gradually relaxed. At the same time, the stone's surface glowed with a golden luster. Although it was very dim and could not be seen without careful observation, the black-robed elder's face quickly softened. 60% gold spirit root, not bad. It's enough to become an inner disciple of our sect. What's your name? The golden-robed boy was delighted when he heard the words. He quickly bowed and said respectfully, Elder, my name is Jin Wei. The old man in black nodded and said with a faint smile, there is a good seedling in this generation of the Jincheng royal family. Jin Wei heard the praise from the elder of the Immortal Gate, and he became complacent for a moment. The arrogance that he had restrained just now appeared again. He stood beside the steward who passed the test and looked at the children who were still queuing up. His nose was almost up to the sky. The second one was Jin Wei's sister, Jin Ying. Obviously, her status in the royal family was not very high, and she had not tested her spiritual root in advance. Her little face looked quite perturbed. She could come with Jin Wei this time because Jin Wei liked her very much. According to the black-robed elder's words, a layer of golden light immediately lit up when she put her tender palm on it. The brightness was even higher than that of Jin Wei. 80% gold spirit root, good. The black-robed elder's eyes brightened, and he said good 3 times in a row. He looked at Jin Ying as if he had found a treasure and said, Little girl, what's your name? His tone was obviously softer than when he talked to Jin Wei before. My name is Jin Ying. Jin Ying said timidly, but her big bright eyes could not hide her joy. She was not a fool. Although she did not understand what 80% gold spirit root meant, one thing was certain, that her future in Huajian's sect was bound to be more brilliant than that of her royal brother. Jin Ying, good name. Inger, stay by my side, the black-robed elder gently told her, and then turned to a steward and ordered, inform the mount heads quickly. The black-robed elder calculated in his heart. An 80% gold spirit root was enough to cause the inner elders to fight for it. Qinghua Mount was called Weimin Mount because there were too few geniuses in the younger generation. Decades ago, Weimin Mount belonged to Li Guang's Fujin Mount. But unexpectedly, the old guy was so lucky that he received a child with immortal latency with acquired body of sword. Now the disciple had entered Yushu sect and was not in Huajian sect, but as long as the person was still alive, Fujin Mount would not fall into Weimin Mount. This experience naturally made the mount heads of Huajian sect begin to pay attention to the children with immortal latency. As long as there was a good seedling among the children, it would inevitably cause a fierce competition. At the same time as the black-robed elder gave the order, several disciples of Weimin branch who were watching from the periphery also quietly retreated, and it seemed that they left for the other 2 mount gates. Okay, continue the test. The black-robed elder calmed down and finally remembered that the spirit test had just begun, so he began to restore the order. However, elite disciples like Jincheng royal family were rare after all. Then dozens of children's palms pressed on the testing stone, but there was no reaction at all. Without the spiritual root, there were only 2 ways out. One was to continue to stay in Weimin Mount as a handyman disciple to seek a glimmer of immortal latency. The other was to go down the mountain and go home to be an honest mortal. But if they didn't know, it would be fine. These children had come to Huajian sect, a land of immortals, and saw the flying immortals. How could they be willing to go back to the original place and continue to live their lives facing the yellow soil? Therefore, all the children who had not been tested with the spiritual root chose to start as a handyman disciple on Qinghua Mount, just like Huang in the past. They still had a glimmer of luck in their hearts. The black-robed elder was disappointed again and again, and soon gave up the idea of testing in person. He asked the steward to take over, and he sat aside with Jin Ying to get closer to them. Jin Wei, who stood alone on the side, was very embarrassed. Who could have thought that his sister, whom he brought as a concubine casually, had a better talent than him? When he thought that he could not have Jin Ying as his own in the future, and it was very likely that he would have to compete with others for Jin Ying's heart, he felt sick in his heart. In the blink of an eye, the test team had gone halfway. Su Li suddenly raised her head to look at the sky, and then quickly lowered her head. No one saw this scene except young Chuanbua, who had been paying attention to her. He looked up at the blue sky and was about to ask Suli what she was looking at. Suddenly, whoosh, whoosh, gusts of violent wind blew from the sky, and the team of children suddenly swayed. Young Chuanbua was the first to bear the brunt of the wind. He was blown to tears and couldn't open his eyes. After the wind dissipated, 3 figures suddenly appeared in the field. When the black-robed elder saw them, he complained in his heart. Why did these 3 come together? While thinking, he quickly stepped forward and saluted. Senior Fellow Apprentice Li, Senior Sister Apprentice Wang, Mount Head, the middle-aged Taoist, who stood on the leftmost and was called Mount Head by the elder, snorted when he heard the words. Only when he saw the little girl, Jean Ying, who was held by him, did he look better. He turned to the other 2 and said, Junior Fellow Apprentices and Junior Sister Apprentices, it's not easy for Qinghua Mount to have such an outstanding talent. Don't compete with me, okay? The middle-aged Taoist was Yuan Shu, the Mount Head of Qinghua Mount. Among the other 2, the thin one in a black robe and carrying a long sword was Han Feng's master, the Mount Head of Fujianfeng, who discovered the genius with acquired body of sword, Li Guang. And the other female practitioner in a light black dress was Wang Yu, the Mount Head of Danxia Mount. Wang Yu looked at Jean Ying, who was as beautiful as a porcelain doll, with a smile and retorted, Senior Fellow Apprentice, you are wrong. Jean Ying is a girl, and it's a little inconvenient for her to follow you. Besides, there are few female disciples on Qinghua Mount. If she doesn't come to Danxia Mount, she will be ruined by you. If you really want this girl, you better take her back. I will teach her personally and cultivate her to be a talent. Yuan Shu scolded her for being cunning in his heart, but he still smiled and shook his head. Impossible. There are many female disciples on Qinghua Mount, and male disciples can also thrive. Junior Sister Apprentice, don't talk about the difference between men and women. At worst, I will throw away my dignity and send her to the main peak. The smile on Wang Yu's face immediately disappeared. This old fox really refused to suffer losses, but she was not so easily persuaded. She turned to look at Jean Ying, who looked innocent. I think it's up to this girl to decide which peak to go to. What do you think, Senior Fellow Apprentice? Yuan Shu was slightly stunned and didn't know what Wang Yu was planning. But when he thought that his junior fellow apprentice and Jean Ying had been intimate for a long time, he was about to agree. At this moment, the steward suddenly exclaimed. The spiritual testing stone suddenly emitted a very strong blue light, which was even more intense than Jean Ying's. Everyone's attention was attracted, and then their eyes fell on young Chuanbua, who was standing beside the stone tablet and at a loss. A complete spiritual root. The 3 Mount Heads reacted and were overjoyed. They flashed to young Chuanbua's side. What's your name? Li Guang restrained his temper and squeezed out a gentle smile on his face, which had never been smiling. Han Feng, who came with Li Guang, saw this scene and hurriedly stepped forward, saying, Master, his name is Yang Chuanbua, and I brought him up the mountain. Yang Chuanbua, a young man born in a barbarian land, had a complete water spiritual root. Han Feng was pleasantly surprised. This was a complete surprise. In this way, he would definitely get a large reward from his master, and he would also form a good relationship with young Chuanbua. My name is Han Feng, and you have to call me first senior fellow apprentice in the future. Looking at young Chuanbua, who was confused, the young man said his name with a smile, but he didn't even look at Suli, who was favored by him before. Yang, would you like to practice with me? Li Guang couldn't wait to ask. Yuan Shu and Wang Yu changed their expressions and immediately stepped forward to stop him. Junior fellow apprentice. Chapter 333. For a time, the 3 high-ranking practitioners of Jindan realm argued endlessly for young Chuanbua in front of many disciples. It seemed that they would not stop for an hour. The steward of Weimin branch and the disciples of each peak all showed envy or jealousy. Unsurprisingly, the most dazzling one among this group of children with immortal latency was young Chuanbua. At least in 10 years, Yang Chuanbua would receive the highest level of training in the sect. Maybe it would not take 10 years for him to cross Lianqi realm from a mortal and step into Zhuji realm in one fell swoop. Different people have different fates. The steward in charge of testing the spiritual root side and waved to Su Li, who was standing in the next position, indicating her to come to test the spiritual root. Su Li withdrew her gaze from Yang Chuanbua and calmed herself down. Then she walked to the testing stone. She was a little surprised that Yang Chuanbua had cultivation talent. However, when she thought that Yang Chuanbua could pick up the parts of the reincarnation mirror in the Taishui River, which was almost dried up, Su Li felt that everything was reasonable. Yang Chuanbua's cultivation luck seemed to be very good. While thinking, the steward had asked her to put her little hand on the testing stone. As soon as she touched it, a cold breath immediately penetrated into her body from Su Li's palm. It traveled in the meridians and pubic region, looking for the spiritual root that resonated with it. Su Li's eyes narrowed slightly. She separated a wisp of her spiritual power and condensed it into a silk thread. Then she split it into 1/10 of the thickness. After hesitating for a moment, she separated 1/10 of the silk thread and collided with that wisp of breath. The steward stared at the testing stone. Seeing that there was no response for a long time, he was about to impatiently drive Su Li to the side that failed. Suddenly, a red halo burst out of the testing stone. Although it was not a complete spiritual root, judging from the brightness, it had clearly surpassed 60% spiritual root and reached 70%. The quality of children with immortal latency this year seemed to be surprisingly high. The steward was stunned. Although he did not understand why the reaction of the testing stone became slow, it did not prevent him from showing a flattering expression and sending Su Li to the 3 peak heads. This little girl's talent was even higher than Jin Ying's. She was ranked second in this batch of children with immortal latent chance. She would definitely be taken in by the peak masters. Good. I didn't expect that among this batch of children with immortal latent chance, there are 4 good seedlings with spiritual roots of more than 50%, and this kid. Li Guang looked at the 4 ignorant children, and a look of joy flashed across his face. He was really happy for the sect. All these years, Senior Sister sect leader had really put in a lot of effort to strengthen the sect. Even her cultivation was affected. Otherwise, how could, thinking of this, Li Guang's face was slightly gloomy. Although it soon disappeared, it still did not escape Su Li's eyes. It seems that Huajian's sect is really in trouble. She lowered her head and stood obediently beside Jin Ying, and a thoughtful look flashed in her eyes. The 70% spiritual root was a complete accident. Before her battle prowess reached the level of her previous life, she didn't want to enter the line of sight of any gold core stage cultivator. But the heavens did not go according to one's wishes. After her rebirth, although she understood the power of the body of evil ghost, she had no idea how powerful it was. She only wanted to show 50% or even less of the spiritual root, but she didn't expect that the spiritual power reduced by 1% still made the testing stone resonate with 70%. It should be known that when she was the holy girl of Yushu sect, she was a peerless talent with 120% celestial spiritual root. But if she reduced her spiritual power to 1% in the 3rd hurdle of Lianqi realm to resonate with the testing stone, she might not even be able to test 20% of the spiritual root. Was her talent 7 times that of the original after her rebirth in this life? Thinking of this, Su Li frowned. 7 times the talent of the celestial spiritual root could at best reach the level of the inborn Taoist body, which was the top talent in the cultivation circle. However, the inborn Taoist body would not be regarded as a thorn by natural law. If the body of evil ghost was at the same level as the inborn Taoist body, then she would suffer a great loss. Jin Ying, standing beside Su Li, looked curiously at Su Li, who looked a little dull and was secretly perturbed. It seemed that this younger sister was not easy to get along with. In the blink of an eye, the sun went down. The spiritual root test that lasted for a day also came to an end. After Su Li, no one could reach more than 50% of the spiritual root. The debate among the 3 mount heads finally ended after the headmaster sent the specific arrangement. Yang Chuanbua finally joined Li Guang's Fujian mount. Su Li and Jin Ying both joined Danxia Mount's Wang Yu. Jin Wei, who had the worst talent among the four, became Yuan Shu's disciple. Both Li Guang and Wang Yu were very satisfied with the result. On the other hand, Yuan Shu's old face was so gloomy that it was about to drip water. Jin Wei, who followed him, kept silent, but he was mad with depression and hatred. It shouldn't be like this. I am the first genius of Jinqing dynasty. There must be something wrong. Why could the poor boy and the two cheap maids enter the Neiman Mount to practice, but he ended up in the worst Neiman Mount? The huge gap made Jinqing extremely aggrieved, and he hated Su Li, the three of them, and the whole sect. The headmaster is too partial. I must ask for an explanation. Yuan Shu snorted coldly and left without taking Jin Wei with him. In the end, the black-clothed elder took him away from the spiritual testing site. Let's go back. Seeing the angry figure disappear, Wang Yufeng's eyes were slightly cold. She held Su Li and Jin Ying in her hands and flew away with a smile. Master, Su. Sister Su, you and I are from the same village. Yang Chuanbua watched Su Li disappear in the sky and said reluctantly. Li Guang couldn't help laughing and touched the former's forehead with a kind face. Silly boy, when you step into Zhuji realm, you can fly on the flying sword. You can go to Danxia Mount at that time. Practice hard. Yang Chuanbua's eyes suddenly lit up, full of fighting spirit. He thought in his heart, Sister Su Li, I must become a practitioner in Zhuji realm as soon as possible, so that I can continue to protect you. Li Guang was old and shrewd. He knew what Yang Chuanbua was thinking at a glance and nodded slightly. He was a person who valued friendship and righteousness. As long as he cultivated the relationship well, he would not be an ungrateful person. But Su Yu, she only had a spiritual root of 70%. Although they fought fiercely for her, she couldn't even enter the sect with such qualifications hundreds of years ago. Without a complete spiritual root, the limit of this life was doomed. It was impossible to break through Zhuji realm and step into Jindan realm. As long as there was no accident, Yang Chuanbua would definitely become a master of Jindan realm. At that time, after Yang Chuanbua met the talented girls of the same generation as him, Li Guang shook his head slightly. Of course, he would not tell these things to Yang Chuanbua. If he told Yang Chuanbua now, it would only cause the new disciples disgust. When Yang Chuanbua noticed the gap between him and Su Yu in the future, he would give him a little advice. After Su Li and Jin Ying were brought to Danxia Mount by Wang Yu, they were settled down by the steward of the sect, and each received a set of the standard dress of the fourth-generation disciples of Qinghua Mount. The fourth-generation disciples were the general term for disciples in Yunyi realm who had not yet stepped into Lianqi realm. To put it bluntly, the 10th hurdle of Yunyi realm was to strengthen the physique and prepare to open the cyclone in the pubic region. It was also the limit that the handyman disciples without spiritual root could reach. Of course, the division of the fourth-generation disciples like Su Li and Jin Ying was only temporary. For example, the small room in front of them. Su Li stood at the door for a moment, glanced at the empty room around her, and pushed the door in. The layout of the room was not exquisite, but it was clean and belonged to her alone. The steward who sent her here said that only disciples who had reached the 5th hurdle of Lianqi realm could have a separate room. If they could reach Zhuji realm and become one of the inherited disciples, they could move to a separate courtyard and recruit 2 handyman disciples as servants. They didn't have to do ordinary trifles in person to disturb their practice. In this way, it's convenient for me to restore my cultivation. Sitting on the edge of the bed and touching the soft mattress, this thought flashed through Su Li's mind. There must be gains and losses. Putting aside the distracting thoughts, Su Li got up and opened the package on the table. There were 2 sets of clothes and a token in it. Su Li's expression changed slightly. The Jinling mask in the secular world. Although this kind of precious light pink satin had no protective effect, it could be sold for hundreds of gold ingots in the secular world. The token was not simple either. It was made of special cyan spiritual wood and contained a one-time protective tactical matrix. It was very valuable. It seemed that Wang Yu was really ready to cultivate her and Jin Ying carefully. Su Li's eyes showed a hint of contemplation. When she was brought to Danxiao Mount by Wang Yu, she tried her best to shrink the spiritual power in her body. Relying on the natural concealment of the evil ghost, Wang Yu didn't find the abnormality. I can't see anything in Jindan realm. It seems that I won't be in too much danger as long as the Yuanying realm and Huajian sect doesn't come out. Su Li was slightly relieved. She put on the light pink disciple clothes, hung the token, and pushed the door to go out. But at the same time, a person happened to come out of the room next door. It was Jin Ying, who had also changed clothes. Seeing Su Li, Jin Ying's eyes brightened slightly, as if she had found the backbone. She hurriedly approached Su Li, but felt it was inappropriate when she approached Su Li. She stopped and stammered after a long while, Su Yu, let's go to the book pavilion together? I am a little scared. Jining felt a little embarrassed after saying that. She was 1 year older than Su Li. She raised her head and thought that Su Li would laugh at her, but Su Li's expression didn't change at all. She just nodded and said lightly, let's go together. Jining was delighted when she heard the words. She took 2 steps forward and held Su Li's arm. Su Li frowned, and finally shook her head slightly and let her go. The book pavilion was in the palace group near the top of the mountain, several miles away from the residence of Su Li and Jin Ying. Jin Ying shrank beside Su Li, and did not forget to quietly look at the many disciples in different clothes who passed by them, as well as the tall pavilions that she had never seen before. Finally, her eyes returned to Su Li, whose expression didn't change much. Although she felt that Su Li was born indifferent, it still made her feel safe. It seemed that as long as she was on Su Li's side, nothing would happen even if the sky fell down. More than an hour later, the two finally came to the book pavilion. Jining was panting. Although Su Li didn't consume much energy, she still needed to pretend. Chapter 334. Get out of the way. A low roar mixed with anger came along with the wind, and it was about to hit Jin Ying, who had a look of horror on her face. At this moment, the gatekeeper disciple saw that Su Li was tripped by something in a panic. She pulled Jin Ying to the side and just escaped the sharp wind. Lucky girl. The gatekeeper disciple breathed a sigh of relief. If she didn't fall like this, she would have to lie in bed for at least 2 months, although she wouldn't die from the impact of the wind. Thinking of this, he watched the young man in white rush into the pavilion with horror. Until he couldn't see the back of the young man, he breathed a sigh of relief. He walked over to pull up Su Li and Jin Ying, who fell on the ground, and persuaded, "You two are unfamiliar. You should be new to the sect, right?" Jin Ying rubbed her knees and burst into tears. Hearing the gatekeeper disciple's question, she nodded obediently and said in a clear voice, "Senior fellow apprentice, my name is Jin Ying. I just joined the sect with junior sister apprentice Su Yu today. It turns out that you are the 2 girls. No wonder." The gatekeeper disciple suddenly realized. Then he looked around carefully. After confirming that there were no other disciples, he bent down and whispered, "Junior sister apprentices, listen to me. Come to the book pavilion tomorrow. The senior fellow apprentice who just passed by has a bad temper. If you annoy him, it will not be a good thing." Jin Ying, who was a little scared, was even more scared after hearing this. She pulled Su Li's sleeve and whispered, "Junior sister apprentice, let's go?" The disciple guarding the door was confused. Why was it that out of these 2 girls, the younger junior sister was the one making the decisions? Su Li was not interested in the practice methods in the book pavilion. She came here just to know what happened in Qingshui Circle in the past 1,000 years. This matter was not urgent, and the book pavilion could not fly. It was the same to come back after she practiced for 2 days. "Let's go." After Su Li said this, she inadvertently glanced at the position of the windowsill on the 2nd floor of the book pavilion, and then turned to leave. Jin Ying quickly followed her. When they walked far away, the disciple guarding the door put away the friendliness on his face and breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, with the help of senior brother Deng, the task assigned by senior sister was finally completed. At the same time, the white-clothed young man standing by the windowsill on the 2nd floor couldn't help but sneer when he saw this scene. and he muttered to himself in a low voice, "So it's because of these two little girls. Junior sister, you're really becoming more and more backward as you live. You even dare to do such a despicable thing. Fine. That way, I won't have to worry too much about competing for rankings in the future." With this thought in mind, the white-clothed young man withdrew his gaze. Suddenly, his eyebrows knitted together. Just now, one of the two little girls with a lotus mark on her face seemed to have glanced in his direction. Could it be that she had sensed him? Impossible. The white-robed young man shook his head, wondering why he would have such a strange thought. Could it be that talking to junior sister you would make one stupid? When they returned to their residence, it was almost noon. Jeaning touched her shriveled belly with a look of grievance. She whispered, "Junior sister apprentice Sue, what should we do? Yesterday, the steward clearly asked us to go to the book pavilion to copy the mental methods of Yunny Realm, but I didn't expect." Suli glanced at her and shook her head. "We'll go tomorrow. You go to eat first." Jeaning nodded and was thinking about what to eat with Suli. Suddenly, she saw that Suli turned around and walked to her room. She couldn't help but ask in confusion, "Junior sister apprentice Sue, where are you going?" Suli paused slightly and said without looking back, "I'm not hungry. You go alone." After that, before Jean-Ing could say anything, she had entered the room and closed the door, leaving Jeaning standing alone outside and at a loss. Back in the room, Suli walked to the futon and sat down. She breathed a long sigh of relief. Wang Yu had been on the mountain last night. For the sake of safety, she didn't practice. Until she sensed that Wang Yu had left this morning and dealt with the matter of the book pavilion, she had time to restore her cultivation. Suli lifted her sleeve and glanced at the seemingly ordinary quaint ring on her wrist. "As my cultivation improves, the effect of reincarnation mirror to shield the mysteries of heaven is getting worse and worse. It seems that I have to arrange the tactical matrix for deception as soon as possible." Thinking of this, Suli frowned. Setting up the tactical matrix was not a long-term solution. She couldn't stay in a fixed place all the time. She must find a magic weapon to shield the mysteries of heaven and carry it with her at all times in order to be at ease. But the magic weapon to shield the mysteries of heaven was so precious that it couldn't be bought in the cultivation market. The only feasible way in front of her now was to repair the ring of reincarnation mirror and improve its ability to shield the mysteries of heaven. "My cultivation is not even enough to arrange the tactical matrix for deception, let alone reincarnation mirror." Suli smiled bitterly, shook her head to get rid of the distractions, and entered the state of meditation. To arrange the tactical matrix for deception, ordinary practitioners could barely arrange it at least at the 7th hurdle of Lianqi realm. Even with her tactical matrix realm, she needed to reach the 5th hurdle of Lianqi realm. Now her cultivation was at the peak of the 3rd hurdle of Lianqi realm, 2 hurdles away. While Wang Yu was not in Danxia Mount, she needed to seize every minute and second, and she didn't bother to think about other trivial things. After a long time, Suli, who was sitting on the bed, burst out the momentum of the 4th hurdle of Lianqi realm. The black spiritual power that escaped was all retracted into her body in less than 3 breaths, and the room became calm again. After a few breaths, Suli's long eyelashes fluttered, and she opened her eyes. "Finally, I broke through to the 4th hurdle of Lianqi realm. The speed is faster than I expected. At this speed, I can make another breakthrough and reach the 5th hurdle in 10 days. Murmuring, Suli pinched her fingers and found that only half a day had passed. She looked at the dark night outside and pondered for a moment. Suddenly, she pinched a strange black mark with one hand and spread it all over her body from her fingers, completely sealing the pneuma that had been restrained to the extreme to prevent the leakage of the pneuma that had just broken through from causing trouble. After doing this, Suli jumped out of bed and put on her clothes. She pushed the door open and was about to go out to inquire about the news. Suddenly, she saw Jeaning squatting on the wall beside the door and sleeping. She frowned. Why did Jeaning sleep in front of her door instead of her own room? Jeaning hadn't started practicing yet, so Suli didn't worry that the movement in the room would be noticed by the woman. But the woman's character was too weak. If she didn't change her character, she would die on the road of cultivation sooner or later. But what did the life and death of others have to do with her? Su Li's eyes were indifferent. The warm-hearted people had already died in the cultivation circle. Perhaps the sound of opening the door was a little loud, and Jean Ying was woken up. She rubbed her sleepy eyes and looked up to see Su Li. She immediately stood up in a panic and waved her hand. I didn't mean to sleep here, I just... Before she finished her words, Jean Ying's stomach growled untimely, which was heard by Su Li. Her face suddenly turned red, and tears appeared in the corners of her eyes. Jean Ying, you are so useless. You don't even dare to go to the dining room alone. It's better to starve to death. Jean Ying thought in despair. She raised her head and was about to explain to Su Li, but Su Li was not in front of her. She was stunned for a moment and saw that Su Li had gone far away, in the direction of the dining room. Her eyes suddenly brightened, and she quickly followed up. Hearing the footsteps behind her, Su Li's expression did not change. She was indeed going to the dining room. At this time, there were the most handyman disciples in the dining room. It was very convenient to use Jean Ying as a cover to inquire about the news. After a while, the two came to the dining room. At this time, it was the time when the handyman disciples finished a day's work and came to eat the spiritual food. The huge 3-story pavilion was so noisy that it could be heard clearly outside. Su Li walked to the door without stopping and stepped in. The noise in the big hall immediately quieted down slightly. In the place where all the handyman disciples in gray clothes gathered, 2 girls in delicate pink clothes suddenly came in, which was really eye-catching. Being stared at by so many people, Jean Ying suddenly flashed a panic in her eyes and hid behind Su Li. On the other hand, Su Li glanced at the audience indifferently and walked directly through the crowd to the spiritual chef to take 2 portions of spiritual food. After stuffing one into Jean Ying's hand, she found an empty seat and sat down. Jean Ying followed and sat down. Looking at the spiritual food on the plate, which did not look very good, she swallowed her saliva and couldn't wait to start eating. She was so hungry. Su Li didn't go out at noon, so she didn't dare to come to eat alone. In addition, she didn't sleep last night. She was tired and sleepy, so she fell asleep soon after sitting in front of Su Li's door. After others saw the two sitting down to eat, the noise in the hall became noisy again, but it was much smaller than before. Many handyman disciples looked at Su Li and Jean Ying with respect and desire in their eyes. Anyone who stayed in Danxia Mount for more than 10 years knew what pink clothes meant. The boy who was valued by the Mount head must have a good cultivation talent. In a few years, these 2 girls would become disciples of the Naiman branch, or even inherited disciples. If they could build a good relationship with them, they might be able to make a meteoric rise and become their servants after they became inherited disciples. The status and power of the servants of inherited disciples of the Naiman branch were terrifying. Even ordinary disciples of the Naiman branch were not willing to offend them. Su Li picked up a plump, round, soybean-sized rice grain and put it into her mouth. A fragrance with sweetness spread in her mouth. She hadn't eaten spiritual grain for a long time. Thinking of the time when she practiced in Yushu sect, Su Li was slightly nostalgic, but Jean Ying was eating spiritual grain and didn't see it. Junior sister apprentice Su, what kind of rice is this? It's so delicious. I have never eaten such delicious rice. Jean Ying's eyes were bright. She said vaguely while eating. Suddenly there was a sneer from the next table. You don't even know spiritual grain. I really don't know how you got into Danxia Mount. Hearing such sarcasm, Jean Ying's face turned pale. She looked at Su Li with embarrassment and a little guilt in her eyes. If she didn't follow them to eat, junior sister apprentice Su, you wouldn't be laughed at. Chapter 335. Su Li withdrew her gaze. That was the token of the personal maid of inherited disciples. No wonder she dared to be presumptuous in front of them. The leading girl saw Su Li's cowardly reaction and immediately mocked. You are really a little girl who has never seen the world. You don't stay at home to take care of your husband and children, but you also want to be an immortal? Be careful that no one will collect your corpse after you die. Jining grew up in the palace. Although she was not favored, she had never heard such outrageous words. Her little face immediately turned red with anger, and she couldn't help but stand up and scold. That's too much. You curse people to death. How did my junior sister apprentice and I offend you? Although what she said was reasonable, Jin Ying's voice was too low, and her weak expression made her look neither fish nor fowl. Seeing this, the four maids all trembled with laughter, which attracted the attention of the surrounding handymen, and then they looked away with fear. Although Su Li and Jining were full of potential and were likely to become inherited disciples in the future, or even reach a higher level, it was only a possibility. These four maids were notoriously bad in Dansha Mount. They were lucky enough to become the personal servants of inherited disciples. Even if they killed one or two disciples of Wyman branch with no potential, their master would cover it up. At present, although the four maids bullied the boy valued by the Mount head, they just verbally abused him, didn't hit him, and didn't endanger his life. They could do whatever they wanted. The harsh laughter kept ringing in her ears. Jining was so angry that her whole body trembled slightly. She showed an indignant expression and was about to continue to argue. The leading maid with the silver token laughed enough. Seeing Jin Ying's reaction, her eyes suddenly became fierce and she snorted. Offend? I'm just telling the truth. Junior sister apprentice, you haven't officially practiced, and you have already begun to lecture your senior sister apprentice? Do you really think that being favored by the Mount Head, you can command us handyman disciples and blame us at will? Jining was so anxious that her face turned red. She bit her lip and shook her head. I didn't. It's you. Shut up. The maid with the silver token looked gloomy. She was young, but her expression was somewhat frightening. Your senior sister apprentice is talking. You have no right to interrupt. As she said, she looked at Su Li, who was still eating silently and did not refute. She smiled and said, Learn from your junior sister apprentice. Sometimes it is not bad to be a coward. As she said this, she came close and pressed hard on Jin Ying's head. Jin Ying, who had not cultivated yet, was certainly not her opponent. She cried out in pain and almost knelt on the ground. This time, seeing that you're new to the sect, I'll let it go. The etiquette of the sect cannot be ignored. When you see me in the future, remember to respectfully call me senior sister. This is the first lesson I'm teaching you. No need to thank me. As she spoke, the maidservant with the silver token began to laugh, and the three maidservants behind her laughed even more wantonly. Under the terrified gazes of the many janitor disciples, they swaggered off. Jining stood there blankly. Even if she did not kneel down, she felt that her self-esteem had been destroyed, and tears fell down. Come and eat. But at this moment, Su Li's slightly cold voice came. Jining turned her eyes blankly and saw Su Li's calm face. The air stagnated for a moment, and Jining gritted her teeth and left angrily. Although she was timid, she disdained to be associated with Su Yu, who compromised and abandoned her dignity. Su Li was slightly stunned, and then shook her head. She bowed her head and continued to eat. She didn't have the leisure to waste time on buzzing flies. It was good for Jin Ying to suffer more, so that she wouldn't stick to her all day long. After the storm passed, the lobby gradually resumed its hustle and bustle. Su Li concentrated her spiritual power on her ears, and all the whispers were clearly heard. Although many people were talking about what had happened just now, Su Li still got a lot of useful information after eliminating all the useless conversations. After confirming that there was no other useful information, she put down the bowl and chopsticks and left, ignoring the pity and disdain of other janitor disciples. Back to the wooden house, Su Li glanced at the closed wooden door next door, and then pushed the door into the room. Today, Wang Yu's Numa was not on the top of the mountain, and she had not returned. She could practice well tonight. However, she didn't rush to practice when she returned to the bed. Instead, she took out a thumb-sized square stone in the heavy bag. Under the dim candlelight, the stone emitted a faint white light. This was the inferior spiritual stone. Janitor disciples could receive one inferior spiritual stone every month, which could speed up the practice of Yunny realm and Lianqi realm. But for Su Li, it was of little use. The quality of the black spiritual power produced by the secret records of Black Lotus that she practiced was too high. The spiritual power extracted from an inferior spiritual stone was purified by the secret records of Black Lotus. She estimated that only the low-grade spiritual stone could work for her. However, I can make it into a low-rank array talisman and sell it for some low-rank spiritual stones. It's just that with my current status, if I sell it once, it'll be fine. If I sell it multiple times, I'll definitely be targeted. Su Li frowned. She wanted to restore her cultivation as soon as possible, and the only easy way at present was to sell matrix runes. Tomorrow, I will go to the marketplace at the foot of the mountain. Maybe I can get something. Thinking of this, Su Li slowly entered the state of practice. She, who was focused on restoring her cultivation, seemed to completely forget one thing. Before dawn the next day, Su Li finished her practice. She put on the gray robe worn by ordinary janitors and went down the mountain. As for the origin of the gray robe, there were many ordinary gray linen clothes on Danxiao Mount. Su Li casually took a set, and no one found it. It was not the time for the janitors to start work, so the mountain road was quite deserted. Only a few janitors went with Su Li. Other janitors glanced at Su Li, and no one said anything. The janitors who went down the mountain at this time did nothing but buy some daily necessities for their masters. After walking for an hour, she finally saw a little outline of the small marketplace hidden in the forest. She was slightly relieved. It seemed that the information collected in the spiritual dining house yesterday was right. Walking down the last stone step, Su Li came to the small marketplace. Both sides of the blue stone road were covered with stalls. Disciples of Danxiao Mount in uniforms of Weimin branch and janitors sat on the ground, shouting like hawkers in the marketplace. Behind many stalls, there were small attics with simple decorations, which looked slightly upscale. At this moment, the sun had risen a little, and there were more and more people in the marketplace. Su Li in gray blended into the crowd inconspicuously. She walked around the marketplace and roughly figured out the structure of the marketplace. The structure was also simple. There were only 2 grades. The stalls on the ground generally sold daily necessities such as fasting elixir and cleaning runes, while the attic sold things really related to practice. Su Li also saw a graded rejuvenation elixir in an attic called Wanyun Pavilion, which was marked with a high price of 50 low-grade spiritual stones. Although it was not a flawless elixir without impurities, it was enough to make any seriously injured practitioner in Zhuji realm recover to his peak state in a short time. I don't know if this elixir was refined by a disciple of Danxiao Mount. If there is such a person, Su Li's eyes flickered, and she finally focused on the plaque of the attic in front of her. Zhenlo Group. It's a little weird that there is a branch of Zhenlo Group in Huajian sect. Zhenlo Group was a mysterious force in Jiuzhou region, specializing in buying and selling materials and magic treasures related to tactical matrices. It had recruited more than 90% of matrix masters in Jiuzhou region. When she was the holy girl of Yushu sect, she was also a guest matrix master of Zhenlo Group, so she knew better than others what a proud force it was. For a small sect like Huajian sect, it was impossible for Zhenlo Group to send people to establish a branch. But now, an attic, which was obviously a branch of Zhenlo Group, was in front of her, which made Su Li feel suspicious. Is it related to the tactical matrix I arranged? Thinking of the strangeness she noticed when she entered the sect, Su Li's immature face flashed with a trace of strange contemplation. Then she walked into the building with a large group of handyman disciples. The familiar smell of matrix materials poured into her nostrils. Su Li was refreshed and looked in the direction of the source of the smell. Sure enough, in a room with transparent walls, a matrix master was inscribing matrix patterns on a piece of low-grade spiritual stone. Judging from his technique, he should be a first-grade matrix master, which corresponded to Lianqi realm. The things he refined could only be bought by people in Lianqi realm. Many Weimin branch disciples of Danxiao Mount stood outside the wall and watched, full of envy. It's so easy for matrix masters to earn spiritual stones. Unlike us who take on the sex tasks and work hard to get such a little reward, Matrix Masters are scarce, so they are naturally distinguished. You should be satisfied that you can be reborn from a mortal and step into Lianchi realm. Skipping the whispers of the crowd, Suli came to rows of transparent cabinets, where various grades of matrix runes and more advanced matrix compasses were placed. Suli soon found the yellow matrix rune she wanted to refine and sell, one for 10 pieces of low-grade spiritual stones. Earth-based rune was a kind of matrix rune with extremely powerful defensive ability. Although it was expensive, as long as a practitioner in Lianchi realm who had adventured outside and had a decent family background, he must have a life-saving magic treasure with him. In addition, Suli turned her head and her eyes fell on another smaller cyan matrix rune, one for 15 pieces of low-grade spiritual stones. Agility rune could add the power of wind to herself, and it was a perfect match for escaping with earth-based rune. Suli's eyes showed a look of contemplation. A piece of low-grade spiritual stone could refine 2 agility runes, but it needed the cultivation of the 9th hurdle of Lianchi realm to support. Even with the spiritual power of secret records of Black Lotus, she estimated that she needed at least the 6th hurdle of Lianchi realm. I can only refine earth-based runes first, and then make plans later. Although she didn't know the purpose of the existence of Jinlo Group, it would be much more convenient for her to sell matrix runes with this building in the sect, and the materials of the tactical matrix for camouflage might also be obtained through this building. Chapter 336. Back to her residence, Suli didn't see Jean Ing again as she expected. She closed the wooden door and sat back on the bed. She took out the inferior spiritual stone and drew a straight line on the surface of the spiritual stone with a sharp silver light on her fingertips without any preparation. Clatter! The square stone was evenly split into 2 triangular stones. If they were weighed, it would be found that the difference in weight between the 2 stones would be no more than 1 yuan. Suli picked up a triangular inferior spiritual stone, closed her eyes, and thought for a moment. Then she murmured in a low voice. The earth nimbus floating in the nothingness slowly condensed on her fingertips, showing a little earthy halo. Sensing the rapid consumption of the spiritual power in her body, Suli didn't dare to waste time and quickly carved on the surface of the spiritual stone. Her speed was many times faster than that of the first-grade matrix master who was admired and envied by others during the day. After a few dozen breaths, the surface of the triangular inferior spiritual stone suddenly burst into a dazzling yellow light. After the light dissipated, there were delicate golden lines on the surface of the inferior psychic awareness, just like the most exquisite handicraft in the world. I made it. Suli sensed that the surging earth nimbus in the psychic awareness was integrated with the spiritual stone. She shook her sore arm, and a little blood appeared on her fingertips. Suli's face was slightly pale, and she shook her head helplessly. The spiritual power of the 4th hurdle of Lianchi realm was still too little. She couldn't afford a spiritual pin now, so she could only use her fingers instead of a pin. But her physical body had not reached the level of her previous life, and the consumption of spiritual power was more than 100 times that of holding a spiritual pin. If her physical strength hadn't reached the peak of Zhuji realm, her fingers would have been broken by force. After these 2 earth-based runes are sold, my cultivation can at least be restored to the 6th hurdle of Lianchi realm. 7 days later, it will be the beginning of next month, and I can get another inferior spiritual rune. When Suli was thinking, suddenly there was a knock on the door. She knew who was standing in front of the door without the psychic awareness. Suli hid the things on the bed, hid her injured hand behind her, and got up to open the door. Jean Ing, who wanted to continue to knock on the door, immediately took a step back like a frightened rabbit. Then she reacted, forced a straight face, and said coldly, I'm not doing this for you. I'm just here to remind you. Don't forget that in a few days, Master will test our cultivation progress. Now 2 days have passed, and we haven't even gotten the mental cultivation method of Yuni realm. You tell me, what should we do? Suli was stunned. Seeing her expression, Jining immediately felt dizzy and asked helplessly, You don't really forget it, do you? Suli pursed her lips and nodded slightly. How could she care about such a trifle? Jining was speechless for a while. Now she finally knew why Suli's performance was good or bad. Suli could forget the important things related to her own fate. So, she was a fool. He didn't know what fear was, much less what humiliation was. It was no wonder that he didn't react at all when he was scolded by those four bad sisters. Did he misunderstand her? Jin Ying's imagination ran wild, and Suli gradually frowned. Anything else? Jin Ying was confused by Suli's question. She was so depressed that she wanted to spit out a mouthful of blood, but she couldn't help but tell Suli what happened during the day. Today, I went to the book pavilion alone. Thinking of the first time, she begged Suli to go to the book pavilion with her. Jining blushed. She immediately thought of something and said angrily, Suli, we are in trouble this time. Someone deliberately prevented us from getting the mental method of Yuni realm. They simply wanted us to lose face in front of the master. Suli raised her eyebrows, and the figure of the young man in white flashed in her mind. I went to the book pavilion today and saw the grumpy senior fellow apprentice again. But this time, I didn't listen to the advice of the gatekeeper disciple and entered the book pavilion. I thought I could get the mental method in this way, but the four bad sisters were also in the pavilion. Jin Ying's eyes turned red, and she didn't say anything. It was not difficult for Suli to guess how the four maids with silver tokens bullied her. Naturally, she couldn't get the mental method. I see. After a moment of silence, Suli simply replied and was about to close the door. Jin Ying's face was full of astonishment. She hurriedly stopped Suli and said anxiously, Junior Sister Apprentice Su, are you really stupid or pretending to be stupid? Now we are in the same situation. If we don't get the mental method to practice, we will be in trouble when the master asks about it. Tomorrow, you go to the book pavilion with me. Maybe we. Suli shook her head before she finished her words. I have something to do tomorrow. Let's go the day after tomorrow. After that, she didn't listen to Jin Ying's nonsense and forcibly closed the door. Jin Ying stared at the bare door blankly for a long time before she came to her senses. She was so angry that she stamped her feet and couldn't help but scold, Coward. Those senior sisters are right. Suyu, you are a coward. When I get the mental method, I won't give it to you. Just wait for the master's scolding. As she said that, she kicked the door heavily. A sharp pain came from the tip of her foot. She sucked in a breath of cold air and looked at the silent night outside. She bit her lip for a while, feeling wronged, and finally limped back to her room. In the room, Suli exhaled and held the second rune that emitted a faint golden light in her hand. She was concentrating on drawing runes just now, so she naturally didn't hear Jin Ying's cry. Early the next morning, Jin Ying still had a trace of fluke in her heart. She came to Suli's door, but no one opened the door after knocking for a long time. She finally couldn't stand it anymore. The grievances accumulated in the past 2 days burst out like a flood. She squatted in front of Suli's door and cried. After an hour, Jin Ying stopped crying. Looking at the still silent wooden door, she showed a touch of stubbornness in her eyes. She wiped away her tears and got up to leave, heading for the book pavilion. At the same time, Suli, who had been wandering in the marketplace for a long time, finally stepped into the Jinlo group. She trotted all the way to the empty window for purchasing materials related to the tactical matrix, took out an earth rune, and said crisply with a pure luster in her eyes, Lord, my master asked me to sell something. The old man sitting behind the window saw that the person who came was a little girl full of spirit. Although she was dressed in the clothes of a servant, the old man couldn't help but show a kind expression on his face because of the spirit and elegance she exuded. Everyone has a love for beauty. In the cultivation circle, good-looking people would also receive a lot of preferential treatment, which was an eternal truth. Well, let me see what your master is selling. The old man reached out to take the earth rune and couldn't help but chuckle after scanning it with his psychic awareness. It turns out to be an ordinary earth rune. The price of Jinlo Group has always been fair. It is priced at 6 low-grade spiritual stones. What do you think, little girl? Suli frowned secretly, but pretended to be surprised and said, Lord, please take another look. My master said that this earth rune is very different, so he is interested in it. Otherwise, with my masters, as she spoke, Suli suddenly covered her mouth, as if she had accidentally spilled the beans, and hurried to remedy it. The old man's eyes flashed. It seemed that the master of this little girl was at least a top-ranking inherited disciple in Huajian sect. How could he be interested in the first-grade earth rune? Thinking of this, he couldn't help but look more serious, and observed the triangular matrix rune in his hand more carefully. The foundation of Jinlo Group was profound, and the elder was well informed. Soon, he noticed a trace of strangeness, and his face changed slightly. He glanced at Suli, who had an innocent face, in surprise and doubt. Then, he stood up and said, Little girl, I will price this earth rune for 50 low-grade spiritual stones. Do you have other matrix runes like this? Suli was slightly shocked. She didn't expect that the old man could offer such a high price, but she showed surprise on the surface. She quickly handed over another matrix rune with her eyes sparkling. That's all. My master only gave me 2. The old man put the 2 matrix runes together in his hands, and they were really integrated. His eyes shone brightly, as if he had found a rare treasure. He hurriedly walked to the depths of Jinlo Group with the matrix rune in his hands. Before leaving, he did not forget to hand over a heavy bag of spiritual stones to Suli. Suli glanced at the building and found that many people had noticed here. She hurriedly asked for help from the steward who gave her the spiritual stones. Lord, my master said that we must leave from the secret exit of Jinlo Group. The steward immediately understood and thought that the master of this little girl was really thoughtful. He had seen the attitude of the elder of Jinlo Group just now, so he naturally did not refuse Suli's request and happily took her to the secret exit. Seeing this scene, many practitioners could only give up the idea of robbing in their hearts. After Suli left Jinlo Group through the secret exit, she didn't stay any longer and immediately went up the mountain to return to her residence. 100 low-grade spiritual stones can at least restore me to the 9th hurdle of Lianqi realm. Suli put the spiritual stones under the rush cushion and breathed a long sigh of relief. Then her eyes flickered, revealing a calculating look. It seems that the appraiser of Jinlo Group knows something. He will definitely investigate me afterward, but she had a clean background. No matter how Jinlo Group investigated, they would never find out her previous life. So, her fictitious master became more mysterious and made Jinlo Group afraid. In this way, she had time to recover. Even if Jinlo Group found out that she was the one who refined the matrix rune in the future, she would have recovered her cultivation at that time. What was there to be afraid of? Thinking of this, Suli smiled slightly, picked up a spiritual stone, and quickly absorbed it. At the same time, in the addendum of Jinlo Group, the old man who appraised Suli just now stood respectfully in front of a delicate woman in a palace dress, who looked about 30 years old, without saying a word. Soon after, the woman in the palace dress exerted force in her hand, and the earth rune made of inferior spiritual stones was immediately crushed. The old man's pupils shrank. When he was about to explain, the woman in the palace dress waved her hand and said, Needless to say, it is indeed the work of a matrix master who can inscribe the first-grade matrix on inferior spiritual stones. Chapter 337. When the old man heard what the woman said, his expression changed slightly, and he said nervously, After all, the big mountain-protecting tactical matrix of Huajian sect is left by that person. If it is really controlled by a tactical matrix master, it is too dangerous for you to stay here. You'd better go back. Calm down, Mr. Wang. The woman in the palace dress patted the powder in her hands and said with a smile, Let's not talk about whether this is true or not. Even if Hua Yin really invites a tactical matrix master, She will not have the courage to open the third layer of this tactical matrix. The price is too low for her. Although the old man called Mr. Wong felt it was inappropriate, he could only nod. The woman in the palace dress held the remaining rune in her hand. After a moment of silence, she suddenly sneered. I am determined to get the star-stacked tactical matrix. If Huayan is sensible, I don't mind exchanging with other tactical matrices. But if she is not sensible, I, Su Zini, am not to be trifled with. Mr. Wong looked slightly serious and whispered, Miss, we don't have much time. If Jinlo Group realizes it, I know. Su Zini's eyes flickered. Within a month, star-stacked tactical matrix will fall into my hands. When I get the inheritance of that place with this tactical matrix, I will surpass Su Zipei soon. Mrs. Wise. Mr. Wong flattered, and then frowned and asked, the girl who sent the rune is a clue. Why don't we follow the clues? No? Su Zini rejected without hesitation. It is a critical period now. Don't make trouble. It is not good for us to anger the tactical matrix master. Mr. Wong felt it was very reasonable, and immediately gave up the idea of investigating Su Li. 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. During these 5 days, the door of Su Li's room had never been opened. During this period, Jean Ing came to find her, but she had to leave when no one opened the door. On the 6th day, when the first ray of light from the east shone on the wooden door, the girl in the room, who was like an old monk in meditation, finally moved slightly. She shook off the gray stone powder and opened her eyes. At this moment, strands of black lines suddenly condensed in her eyes that were as clear as the sky, transforming into a lifelike lotus that swayed in the void for a moment before dispersing with a loud bang. Su Li exhaled a long breath and waved her hand to set off a gust of wind, sweeping away the accumulated stone powder on the rush cushion. She looked at the dark spiritual lake in her pubic region, which had occupied 70% of the entire pubic region. Level 7 of Qi Disciple? Su Li frowned slightly and picked up the remaining 7 low-grade spiritual stones on the edge of the rush cushion. A full 93 low-grade spirit stones only let her advance from the 4th level of Qi cultivating to the 3rd level of Qi cultivating? Too slow. This kind of progress was far lower than her expectation. The unexpected joy of selling 2 earth-based talismans at a high price also faded in her heart. She originally thought that relying on these 100 low-grade spirit stones, even if she couldn't recover to the 1st level of foundation establishment, it would be more than enough for her to reach the 10th level of Qi refining. It should be noted that a practitioner with a complete ordinary spiritual root would consume no more than 49 stones from the first hurdle of Lianqi realm to Zhuji realm. Even in Yushu's sect in the previous life, with her heavenly spiritual root, she only absorbed about 110 low-grade spiritual stones to successfully break through. But now, the change was too great. The speed at which she absorbed low-grade spirit stones was frighteningly fast. For ordinary aura refining cultivators, absorbing 1 low-grade spirit stone a day was already their limit. However, in less than 5 days, she had already absorbed close to 100 low-grade spirit stones. On average, she consumed 20 spirit stones a day. Su Li couldn't help but be speechless. She felt that the road ahead was difficult. It took her 100 spiritual stones to advance from the 4th level to the 7th level. She didn't know how much more it would take to advance to the 3rd level of Qi cultivating. Thinking of this, Su Li spread out her palm. With a thought, a group of dark spiritual power appeared in her palm. The extremely condensed black shone like a gem in the slightly dark room. No wonder. The quality of the spiritual power has reached the 4th level of foundation establishment. Of course, the low-grade spiritual stones are useless. I should be able to absorb the middle-grade spiritual stones now. Taking back the spiritual power, Su Li hesitated for a moment and injected a wisp of spiritual power into the ring of reincarnation mirror. In the past, when the quality of the spiritual power was still at the level of Lianqi realm, she had tried it, but the ring of reincarnation mirror did not respond at all. Now that the quality of the spiritual power had reached Zhuji realm, she wanted to try if she could repair the mirror ring slightly. so that she could save the energy of arranging the tactical matrix for camouflage. After 10 minutes, there was no movement from the mirror ring. Suli was silent and continued quietly. With the consumption of the spiritual power in her body, her face gradually became pale. An hour later, Suli's forehead was covered with cold sweat, and her body trembled slightly. The spiritual power in her body had been squeezed to the last drop, but at this moment, her eyes were as bright as day. Under her gaze, there was a trace of black luster on the surface of the originally dim ring of reincarnation mirror. If you didn't look carefully, you couldn't see it at all. A faint suction came from the mirror ring. Suli's eyes were slightly fierce. She grabbed the remaining low-grade spiritual stones with one hand, and the latter turned into powder in the blink of an eye. All the spiritual power flowed into the mirror ring through Suli's body, and the spiritual power floating in the surrounding nothingness was directly sucked up. Not enough. Suli clenched her silver teeth, almost bleeding, but she was already at the end of her rope. If she continued, it would consume her foundation, which was not worth the loss. Do I really want to waste all my previous efforts? Suli was a little unwilling, but her reason prevailed. She slowly moved her hand away from the mirror ring. Suddenly, the black lotus ring appeared from the ring finger. The black lotus pattern slowly rotated, and an obscure and profound secret method was transmitted into the awareness sea. After understanding the meaning of the secret method, Suli's eyes suddenly condensed. Without saying anything, she slapped the heart with a strange method. The severe pain affected the nerves, and Suli's face immediately turned pale. Then she opened her mouth and spat out a mass of bright red blood. Blood from the heart. It would take at least half a month for her to recover after spitting out the heart blood. Black Lotus Ring, don't let me down. With a gasp, Suli pinched her fingers with difficulty and pinched a gesture with a strange shape beyond the common sense of the human clan. At the moment when the gesture began, the shape of the blood mass floating in the nothingness suddenly changed and seemed to form the outline of a word. Crack, crack, crack. The finger bones constantly made unbearable sounds, and the severe pain made Suli faint. But she understood that if she gave up now, it would really be a heavy loss. She had no way out. Crack. Suli's movements were stiff, and she sweated like rain. Her little finger hung down softly. If it went on like this, she was afraid that before the gesture was completed, her 10 fingers would be broken. She must speed up. But the pain of speeding up would be increased 100 times. A ruthless expression flashed between her eyebrows, and her movements immediately accelerated. The continuous sound of bones cracking sounded like firecrackers. In just a few breaths, the blood mass in the nothingness turned into a word, slave, at a speed visible to the naked eye. The bright red blood suddenly turned dark, just like Suli's black spiritual power. With the last strength, Suli gritted her teeth and sent the blood mass into the ring. Then, regardless of the result, she fainted on the rush cushion. After a long time, Suli frowned and opened her eyes. Thinking of what happened before she fainted, she woke up quickly and sat up directly. Jean Ing, who was holding the porridge bowl, was startled. Jean Ing threw the porridge bowl to the bed. Suli subconsciously wanted to catch it, but this movement made her 10 fingers hurt so much that she almost fainted again. Seeing that the porridge was finally spilled on the bed without burning Suli, Jean Ing breathed a sigh of relief. She quickly took a rag to wipe the bed and whispered, "Don't worry. I didn't tell anyone that you were hiding here. No bad guys will find it." Suli was stunned and didn't know why. Jean Ing had leaned over and looked at Suli's hand distressingly. She said tearfully, "Those people went too far. They didn't allow us to practice and hurt you like this. Don't worry. When I become stronger in the future, I will definitely avenge you." Hearing Jean Ying's words, Suli understood that this girl probably blamed her injury on the 4 maids with silver tokens. She looked down and saw that her 10 fingers were well bandaged, and the blood on her body was cleaned up. It was hard to imagine how a princess who grew up in the imperial palace learned these things. Her psychic awareness covered her whole body, and a feeling of weakness arose spontaneously. She frowned. The spiritual power lost in the pubic region had not been replenished in time. But when her psychic awareness flowed to her wrist, she couldn't help but smile slightly. The ring of reincarnation mirror had a feeling of being connected with her heart and blood. In this life, she was no longer a puppet in the hands of reincarnation mirror. Even one day in the future, she could become the real owner of reincarnation mirror. Even if reincarnation mirror became a broken thing now, it still didn't hinder Suli from being happy. One day, she would wake up the mirror spirit. She must get back what happened in the illusion. It was not her style not to take revenge. When she looked up and saw Jean Ying with a worried face, Suli's cold eyes became a little more gentle. Indeed, Suli never claimed to be a righteous person. For the sake of practice, she did something out of line without any psychological burden. She had always been indifferent to strangers, but once someone got her approval, Jeaning was only 15 years old. It was normal for her to be afraid when she entered the sect at a young age, so she was more dependent on Suli. But she was in trouble and didn't want to have cause and effect with others. So, her attitude towards Jean Ying was naturally very indifferent. But this girl, even if she was rejected by Suli again and again, she still saved Suli without hesitation when she saw Suli sneaking into the room. Maybe it couldn't be called saving, and maybe this way was stupid, but there was no doubt that she had won Suli's favor. She looked up at Jean Ying with a faint smile and teased, "I remember someone said that she would never talk to me, a coward." Jean Ying's little face immediately turned red, and she stammered and retorted, You must have heard it wrong. I didn't say that." After saying this, Jean Ying suddenly froze, and then looked at Suli with great shock. Suli was stunned, and then asked with a smile, "Is there anything on my face?" "No, no." Jean Ying opened her mouth slightly, and finally confirmed that what she saw in front of her was not an illusion. She said blankly, You actually smiled." After joining the sect for so many days, she had never seen Suli smile, let alone talk to her so gently. Chapter 338. Suli didn't explain anything to Jean Ying. She preferred to explain everything with actions. Jean Ying seemed to be used to Suli's style of doing things. After feeding Suli porridge again, she left quietly. If she stayed here all the time, she would inevitably be discovered. Looking at the night outside, Suli's spiritual stone spread like mercury, and soon all the surrounding buildings appeared in her psychic awareness. This was a relatively remote woodshed, not far from Jean Ying and her residence, but no one was assigned to it, so it had been empty. Suli didn't know how Jean Ying found this place. There is still no Numa of Wang Yu on the peak. Suli withdrew her psychic awareness and pondered. On that day, Wang Yu told them to get the mental method of Yunny Realm by themselves and come back a few days later to check their progress. It was inappropriate to give such an order. On the surface, she and Jean Ying were just ordinary girls who had just entered the sect and knew nothing about cultivation. As the saying went, the master leads the way, but the cultivation depends on the individual. But Wang Yu didn't even take the step of leading them in, which was too irresponsible. Although Dansha Mount is a little chaotic, the cultivation of those disciples is not bad. Wang Yu should not be such an irresponsible person. She should be delayed by something. Suli speculated, and the thought dissipated. It's good that no one disturbs me. When my injury recovers, I will take the girl to the book pavilion. Suli calmed down and concentrated on recovering her spiritual power. She still had many things to do. Although the ring of reincarnation mirror had a connection with her, the effect of shielding the nature's mystery was not enhanced. Somehow, the body of evil ghost gave her an intuition that when she broke through Zhuji realm, even if she hid in the mountain-protecting tactical matrix of Huajian sect, she would be in danger of being discovered by natural law. The tactical matrix of camouflage still needs to be prepared. Fortunately, it seems that Wang Yu will not come back in a short time, so I still have time. Thinking of this, the last trace of thinking in Su Li's eyes faded away, and she completely entered the state of meditation. Only a trace of psychic awareness wandered outside and was alert to the outside world. Several days passed in the blink of an eye. In these days, Jin Ying came several times intermittently and brought Su Li a few bowls of spiritual rice porridge. The injury on Su Li's hand had recovered a lot, so she didn't need Jin Ying to feed her anymore. She saw that Jin Ying wanted to say something to her several times, but she didn't ask. "Tomorrow, I'll go to the library with you." Putting down the empty bowl, Su Li suddenly said. She could naturally sense that more than 10 days had passed, but the girl still hadn't stepped into Yunti realm. It was time to solve the trick in the book pavilion. Jin Ying was slightly stunned, and then her face changed slightly. She shook her head and said, "You can't go." "Why?" Su Li frowned slightly, and Jin Ying's heart tightened for no reason. It seemed that the consequences would be very serious if they disobeyed the will of the person in front of them. Dispelling the strange thoughts in her mind, Jin Ying sighed helplessly and said sadly, "Junior sister, don't ask. Once you've recovered, we'll descend the mountain together. The immortal Tao is destined to have no fate with us." Su Li raised her eyebrows slightly. Looking at the gray disciple uniform worn by Jin Ying, she said nothing more. Jin Ying thought that Su Li had listened to her, so she didn't say much. She picked up the lunchbox and left the woodshed. Seeing that Jin Ying's movements were no longer jerky, Su Li felt strange. Jin Ying didn't go to the book pavilion these days. What could she do? It was a silent night. In the early morning of the next day, Su Li woke up from meditation. She could stretch her fingers freely, and her injury had almost recovered. Even if she fought with others, she would not be affected. It's time to solve some troubles. Murmuring in a low voice, Su Li got up, put on the pink disciple uniform, and walked to the book pavilion. When the purple air came from the east, it was the best time to practice. All the pavilions above the mountainside of Danxiao Mount were lifeless and immersed in practice. The guarding disciple of the book pavilion sensed the rising pneuma everywhere, and he was full of expectations. When his guarding task was over, he would take the reward from the first senior sister to practice well. At this moment, the guarding disciple suddenly saw a pink figure not far away. He stared at her. Wasn't Jin Ying already? How dare she come? Su Li came closer. The guarding disciple saw her quite strange face, and then remembered that she was the other child with immortal latency who came with Jin Ying on the first day. It was just that this girl's sense of existence was too low. If she didn't appear now, he would have forgotten that there was such a girl. The instructions of the first senior sister did include her. It was not easy to get rid of Jin Ying, and it was just a few days of peace. Su Li glanced at the guarding disciple, who looked a little unnatural. She stretched out her hand to hand out the token, and said lightly, "Can I go in?" The guarding disciple was suddenly stunned. Looking at Su Li, who looked a little cold, he couldn't help but wipe his eyes. Was this the same person as the weak girl who came last time? "Senior fellow apprentice," Su Li reminded him. The guarding disciple suddenly shivered and returned the token to Su Li. When he was about to dispel her idea of receiving the mental method, he found that Su Li directly turned around and walked inside, without giving him a chance to speak. At the thought of the reward he was about to get, the guarding disciple's face suddenly became gloomy, and he said bitterly, "Little girl, you asked for it." He took out a carrier rune from his arms, sketched on it, and crushed it. When Su Li stepped into the gate of the book pavilion, a fresh and elegant ink fragrance immediately came to her face. Most of the carriers of precious mental methods in the cultivation circle were jade slips, and the contents could only be obtained by exploring with psychic awareness. Some less important cultural miscellaneous records, geographical records of the cultivation circle, and other popular knowledge were mostly in the form of book rubbings. The first floor of the book pavilion was mostly used as bookshelves instead of the matrix platform for placing jade slips. Su Li glanced around and immediately saw the elder of mental method on the first floor dozing off behind the counter. She went to the counter without saying anything, took out a blank rubbing, and knocked on the table. This knock was extremely exquisite. Suli had secretly used the secret method of sound attack, but the elder of mental method on the first floor only had the cultivation of the fifth hurdle of Lianchi realm. Naturally, it was difficult for him to detect it. He just suddenly felt upset and wanted to do something. When he opened his eyes and saw Suli holding the blank rubbing, he was suddenly stunned. Before he figured out the situation, he saw Suli respectfully handed over the rubbing and said, "By the order of the Mount Head, I specially come to copy the rubbing of the mental method of Yunti realm. Elder, please give me the original copy." The elder of mental method of Yunti realm subconsciously handed over the original copy in a daze. When Suli took it and began to copy, he suddenly woke up with a quiver. Oh, it was the child with immortal latency. "Stop!" The elder of mental method shouted and tried to grab the writing brush in Suli's hand. Suli's hand was empty. She raised her head and looked colder. "Elder, what can I do for you?" The elder of mental method saw that Suli was not frightened at all, but there was a meaning of questioning in her words. He couldn't help but be speechless. He couldn't think of a reason to stop her for a while. He secretly cursed the 4 maids of Yulin. Who said that these 2 girls were cowards? How to explain the one in front of him? Suli slightly raised her eyebrows and hid her fingers in her sleeves. She condensed a trace of spiritual power and quietly extended it to the edge of the tactical matrix to the upper stairs. The tactical matrix to protect the book pavilion was originally a submatrix of star-stacked tactical matrix. Suli broke a small hole without any effort. After pretending that it was accidentally damaged, she then questioned, "Elder, could it be that you want to help me get a better brush? Or, you don't want to listen to the order of Mount Head at all, and give me the mental method of Yunti realm?" Seeing that Suli was not afraid at all at such a young age, the elder of mental method was embarrassed and immediately became angry. He crushed the writing brush in his hand into pieces. "Presumptuous! You are just a little handyman disciple. Who gave you the courage to offend me?" "Oh?" Suli glanced at the eyes gathered around her and the tactical matrix of the second layer that had some movement. She sneered, "You're so powerful. Courage? I think, Elder, you are more courageous. For your own selfish desire, you stop your disciple from copying the mental method. I also want to ask, who gave you the courage?" Hearing this, the disciples who came to watch the fun suddenly changed their faces. They put down the books in their hands and hurried away. They couldn't afford to get involved in this vortex. Elder Shinfa was so angry that he almost fainted. He resisted the urge to slap Suli to death, pointed at her nose tip and scolded, "Nonsense. You know how to confuse people at such a young age. For the sake of Mount Head, you can be punished for the death penalty, but you can't escape punishment. I will let you know who has the final say in the book pavilion." After Elder Shinfa said this, he slapped Suli's delicate face with a palm as big as a cattail leaf fan. This slap must make Suli's skin bleed. The few disciples who dared to stay to watch the fun suddenly felt unbearable and turned their heads. Suli didn't dodge. She glanced at the hole in the tactical matrix whose fluctuations subsided, and there was a trace of coldness in her eyes. How did Hua Yin manage the sect in such a foul atmosphere? If Dansha Mount only had these people who fawned on the rich and were obsessed with power, then Dansha Mount didn't need it. Just when Suli was about to fight back and expose herself, suddenly, a faint voice echoed in the awareness sea of Elder Shinfa. "Who has the final say in the book pavilion?" "Elderly, you're really awe-inspiring as a mental cultivation elder. If even half a strand of hair on this girl's head is injured, you'll have to go to the Cold Wind Pagoda to reflect on your mistakes." As soon as Elder Shinfa heard the Cold Wind Tower, he stared with his eyes wide open. He forcibly withdrew his palm with his pneuma and blood flowing in the opposite direction, and almost spat out a mouthful of blood. What's going on? How can the first elder know what happened on the first floor? Elder Shinfa was full of horror. His next words and deeds would be noticed by the first elder. If he still persisted in doing things the wrong way, he must go to the cold wind tower. Thinking of this, Elder Shinfa showed a kind smile. After a while, he was suddenly dumbfounded. It seemed that he didn't even know the name of this girl until now. Chapter 339. Hearing the footsteps, Elder Shinfa immediately thought of something, and his face changed. Before he could do anything, the 4 maids with silver tokens had stepped into the book pavilion. Seeing Suli holding the rubbing in her hand, the leading maid's face immediately darkened. She stepped forward and scolded, "Little bitch, you refuse a toast only to drink a forfeit." As she said, she was about to step forward and slap Suli. Elder Shinfa remembered the instructions of the first elder, and his eyes turned red. He grabbed the maid's arm and waved it hard. Clap. The crisp and loud applause resounded throughout the book pavilion, and the maid suddenly went crazy. "Li Zhonggui, are you tired of living? How dare you hit me?" She didn't understand why Li Zhonggui, who had always flattered her, would hit her. Didn't he want the reward from the master? Li Zhonggui smiled coldly. He was about to die, and he didn't care about the reward. As handyman disciples, you only have one chance to enter the book pavilion every month. If you want to enter again, you have to pay contribution points. But you just broke in recklessly and didn't pay attention to the rules of Dan Xiaomount at all. Do you think you deserve to be beaten? The maid was slightly stunned and looked at Li Zhonggui as if she was looking at a fool. Rules? Li Zhonggui, are you stupid after practicing too much? How dare you talk about rules with me? If you don't make it clear today, you will die when I go back and tell the master. Who is your master? Suli suddenly spoke, and everyone could not help but be slightly stunned. At this moment, she dared to interrupt. One of the other 3 maids seemed to be unable to hold back. She stood up and looked at Suli as if she was looking at a dead person, and said coldly, "Little sister, listen carefully. Our master is the next master of Dan Xiaomount, first senior sister apprentice Yulin. If you offend her, do you think you still have a way to live?" Suli was silent, and the maid immediately thought she was afraid and laughed wantonly. Li Zhonggui's heart sank, and his eyes showed worry. Yulin was too powerful, and it was still unknown whether the first elder would be her enemy or not. But not long after, he received the sound transmission of the first elder again. After hearing the instructions, he immediately breathed a sigh of relief, and his face became tough again. "Guards, chase these troublemaking maids out of the library pavilion. If you resist, kill without mercy." The maidservant fell into a complete daze upon hearing this, and her eyes were filled with disbelief. How could he, a mere refining stage elder, dare to disobey the master's order? Shwa shwa shwa. Groups of law enforcement disciples with powerful auras rushed in. The 4 maids' faces paled and their bodies began to tremble. Apart from their backers, they were just maids at the peak of Yuni realm. Not to mention a team of law enforcement disciples, even one of them was enough to defeat them. Seeing that Suli was protected by Li Zhonggui, the head maid with a silver token showed deep hatred on her face. "Wicked girl, if you have the ability, you can stay in the book pavilion for a lifetime. Let's go." Suli narrowed her eyes slightly, and the dim light flowed in them. Li Zhonggui did not notice her change. After the 4 maids left, he finally had time to hand over the golden rubbing in his hand to Suli and explained, "This is a rubbing of Yuni realm personally copied by a genius of Dan Xiaomount. It has a better effect on practice. Take it back and send it back to the book pavilion after you understand its meaning." Suli took over the rather heavy rubbing, smiled slightly, and nodded. "Thank you, Elder." Once she took action, in order to ensure that the details were not leaked, she must kill all the witnesses. As the real master of the star-stacked tactical matrix, it was not difficult for her to do this. It could be said that the person who secretly stopped Li Zhonggui not only saved the lives of everyone in the book pavilion, but also saved herself. Don't be so polite. Li Zhonggui waved his hand and looked at Su Li's calm face. He was surprised and doubtful in his heart. He did not know whether she was really calm, or she did not understand the situation after today. If she annoyed the proud master, it was hard to guarantee that she would not do something out of line. However, this matter had been reported to the First Elder, and Su Li's life or death had nothing to do with him. Naturally, he would not be a good person to remind her. He just waved his hand to let Su Li leave, and hurried to the top floor of the book pavilion. 4 maids with silver token returned to an extremely spacious and exquisitely decorated courtyard near the top of the mountain. The leading maid dismissed the 3 people behind her. She passed through several courtyard doors and came to the adytum located in the deepest part of the courtyard. She knelt down and cried, "Master, please forgive me. I screwed up." Before she finished her words, the door of the adytum rumbled open. Yulin, wearing a light green gauze dress, swayed out of the door and sat on the chair in the outer room. Her expression was indifferent but inviolable. The chief maid knelt on the ground and did not dare to breathe. As time passed, there were only Yulin's gentle tapping on the table and the maid's slightly heavy breathing in the room. Finally, at a moment when the maid could not bear it, Yulin opened her mouth with a high prestige. "Chun, what's the matter? Don't tell me that you can't even deal with a 15-year-old child." The maid's body tightened, and she quickly said, "Master, it's not Jining," but another girl suddenly launched an attack. I don't know why Li Zhonggui went crazy. He even invited the law enforcement team and drove us all out of the book pavilion. We couldn't stop it. That girl should have got the rubbing of Yunny realm. What? Yulin's eyes opened slightly, and the maid immediately lowered her head even more, wishing to stick to the ground. Yulin's eyes were indifferent, and she withdrew her gaze. Chun had been with her since she was a child for 10 years. She naturally would not doubt what Chun said. However, did Li Zhonggui dare to confront her? Yulin sneered. If there was no one behind him, then he was really tired of living. The secret realm of shattered spirits is about to open, and I am in need of cultivation resources. I don't know what the old thing Wang Yu is thinking. She even wants to give half of my resources to those 2 useless children with immortal latency. I can't tolerate any sand in my eyes. Chun knelt on the ground tremblingly and did not dare to talk nonsense. She had heard her master disrespectful to the Mount Lord more than once, and she had long been used to it. Su Li's hateful and plain face appeared in her mind. She suddenly plucked up her courage and said, "Master, why bother? Since you don't want those 2 little maids to mess things up, why not?" Chun said, and made a gesture of cutting her neck. Yulin was slightly stunned and raised her eyebrows. She said in surprise, "I didn't expect you to have such courage. This has crossed the bottom line. If I am found out, my position as the first disciple will come to an end." Chun thought she had said something wrong and suddenly looked flustered. But Yulin waved her hand indifferently. The position of the first disciple is related to the quota of the secret realm of shattered spirits. Otherwise, who cares about this position? However, you have reminded me. As she spoke, Yuling flipped her palm and a jade talisman that glowed with spiritual light flew into Chun Er's hand. "Take this talisman and go to the market at the foot of the mountain to find someone. Tell him, it's about time. When you make your move, get rid of those 2 girls." Chun was shocked. She knew her master's plan very well. Was her master finally going to kill that senior fellow apprentice? It was like killing a chicken with a butcher's knife to kill a cow by asking that lord to kill Jining and Su Yu. A trace of pleasure appeared on Chun's face, and she sneered. Su Yu was doomed. Su Li returned to her original residence with the golden rubbing in her hands. She walked to the place where Jining lived next door. When she was about to knock on the door, she suddenly frowned and gently pushed the door open. There was no one inside, and Jin Ying's pneuma was very faint. That girl hadn't come back to live for at least 3 days. Was it because of her broken finger that she was also afraid and found another place to hide? Su Li frowned and turned to the woodshed where Jin Ing had hidden her. The residences of handyman disciples on Danxia Mount were widely distributed. It was impossible for her to find them, so she could only wait for her in the woodshed. Approaching the woodshed, Su Li suddenly heard a faint cry. She immediately quickened her steps and pushed open the door of the woodshed. Suddenly, she saw Jining squatting on the edge of the bed, crying like a pear blossom in the rain. There was a meal box beside her, which contained hot spiritual rice porridge. Seeing that Su Li suddenly came back intact and stood in front of her, Jin Ing was instantly stunned. Then an unspeakable grievance rose from the bottom of her heart. She directly got up and threw herself into Su Li's arms, wailing, "Wu, I thought you were dead. They all say, Yu Chun is a devil who kills without batting an eye. Wu, I thought I would never see you again. Wu?" Su Li didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Hearing the cry of the little girl, she gradually calmed down and gently patted her back. She really couldn't bear to hate this girl. After a while, Jining stopped crying. She blinked her red and swollen eyes and asked aloud, "Junior Sister Apprentice Su, where have you been?" I thought. Before she finished her words, she saw Su Li take out the golden rubbing and put it in front of her. "I brought the mental method of Yunti realm." Hearing this, Jin Ying's eyes suddenly widened, and she stammered and couldn't say a complete sentence. You didn't." Su Li nodded and said with a smile, "I went to the book pavilion." Jin Ying was confused and immediately picked up the golden rubbing and was about to rush out of the door. Su Li was confused, and Jin Ying suddenly stopped and said in a panic, "Junior Sister Apprentice Su, run away. If you are found stealing, you will definitely be beaten to death." She begged for 10 days, but Elder Xinfa didn't say anything and didn't copy it for her at all. Now Su Li suddenly took out such an exquisite rubbing. She couldn't think of any other way except stealing. Su Li couldn't help laughing and was about to explain. Suddenly, her face changed, and she looked up at the door over Jin Ing. Jin Ing looked back with some doubts. She was so scared that she trembled and retreated to Su Li's side. Under the tree, not far from the door, there stood a silent figure wrapped in a black robe. Chapter 340. The evening lights were dim, and the thin man in a black robe standing under the tree looked weird. "Who are you?" Jining grasped Su Li's lapel tightly and plucked up her courage to ask. Before she finished her words, the black robe wrapped around the man's face fell, revealing a slightly pale face. This face was so ordinary that no one would notice him if he stood in the crowd. After the black robe was taken off, a faint breath of nauseating blood spread from his body. The emerald green branches stained with this breath immediately showed a tendency to wither. Su Li's eyes were slightly fixed. A blood practitioner, who had practiced to the 6th hurdle of Zhuji realm. How could there be such an evil practitioner in Huajian sect? Seeing those withered flowers and plants, Jin Ing was so scared that her face turned pale. She pulled Su Li with a trembling voice. "It's terrible. Let's run away. There is a window behind the house. Before Jining finished her words, the man standing under the tree at the door suddenly blurred. He approached her in a few flashes and knocked her out with a palm. "So noisy. I don't like noisy children." The man's voice was hoarse and unpleasant, like fingernails rubbing on a rusty copper surface. The room quieted down. The man turned his bloody eyes and looked at Su Li, who was still calm. He said with interest, "You don't seem to be afraid of me?" Su Li smiled slightly and said in a flat voice, "You? What's there to be afraid of?" The man was slightly stunned when he heard the words, and then the interest in his eyes became stronger. "It's interesting. A mortal girl who has not yet entered Tao has no awe for cultivation. I have never seen such a thing. You are the first one. Originally, the one who sent me the message asked me to kill you 2 little girls directly. But now, I have changed my mind. Su Li raised her eyebrows. What's the idea? The man laughed in a low voice and pointed to Jin Ying, who had fainted on the ground. Kill her. As long as you kill her, I will accept you as a disciple and take you away from Huajian sect. I will even teach you all I know and make you as free as me. After that, he looked at Su Li expectantly, almost foreseeing how excited and ecstatic she would become. It was her favorite thing to make people hope and then let them die in despair. However, the truth was clearly not progressing in the direction he had hoped for. Su Li curled her lips slightly, and her calm eyes became sarcastic. You, a blood practitioner in Zhuji realm, dare to say that you are free and unfettered in the cultivation circle? As soon as the words came out, the man's face changed wildly. He finally realized the extraordinariness of Su Li and subconsciously wanted to keep away from her. But at this time, he found that a white and delicate little hand had been put on his shoulder, and then, boom. An incomparably heavy force suddenly erupted, as if Mount Tai was pressing down on him. Half of the man's shoulder directly collapsed with a kacha sound, and all his internal organs were crushed. You. The man's eyes widened, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. He couldn't understand why Su Li, who looked weak and harmless, had such terrifying strength, and her temperament was decisive and cold-blooded. She was more like an evil practitioner than him. Spare me. Feeling that the huge force on his shoulder was getting heavier and heavier, the man said with difficulty. He didn't think about anything now, and only hoped to survive in the hands of Su Li. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly, and suddenly smiled. Okay? The man looked happy. Su Li raised her left hand, and under his horrified expression, she slapped on the top of his head. Ah, you said. The man's eyes were bloodshot. After squeezing out the 4 words, his head drooped down, and he could no longer speak. Su Li slowly withdrew her hand and muttered to herself, I have seen your eyes many times, but I don't have the habit of explaining to living people. Glancing at Jin Ying, who was still in a coma, Su Li waved her hand to close the wooden door and returned to the bed with Jin Ying in her arms. She reached out and hit Jin Ying's Haitian acupoint to make her sleep deeper. After doing these, Su Li returned to the man's corpse, took off the universe bag from his waist, and was lost in thought. Although it was the first time that she killed someone since reincarnation, her memory was still there, and she had long been numb to life and death. Looking at the bloody corpse in front of her, her heart didn't fluctuate at all. My cultivation has not recovered to Zhuji realm, so I can't use the soul-searching skill. However, I can also guess that the first disciple, Yulin, is behind this person, so I don't need to waste my energy. Thinking of this, Su Li frowned. How should she deal with this person's corpse? If it was an ordinary practitioner, she could burn it with fire, but he was a blood practitioner who had reached Zhuji realm. He had swallowed at least tens of thousands of people's blood essence, so his blood and energy were so strong that they didn't disperse. After his death, the blood and energy would evaporate, and even the universe bag couldn't stop it. It might even become poisonous blood and contaminate the entire Danxiao Mount. If she burned it with fire, the blood and energy would only evaporate faster. She didn't want to be exposed now, and she couldn't let the only corpse ruin her plan. Looking at the dark night sky outside, Su Li shook the black robe and wrapped the corpse. She lifted it with one hand and was about to push the door open to find a remote place to deal with it. But at this moment, a rainbow flashed in the sky and fell into the hall on the top of Danxiao Mount. Su Li immediately stopped and looked slightly serious. Wang Yu was back. If she went out to deal with the corpse of the blood practitioner at this moment, the movement would definitely be noticed by Wang Yu. She must find another way. Perhaps sensing Su Li's thoughts, Black Lotus Ring suddenly emerged on its own and rotated slowly. This time, instead of sending any useful information to Su Li, it sent a suction force to the corpse wrapped in black cloth. Su Li was slightly stunned, and sensed that Black Lotus Ring seemed to be asking for her opinion. Can you deal with this corpse? Suli frowned and sent out an idea. Black Lotus Ring rotated more cheerfully, and the suction force also increased. Obviously, it acquiesced to Su Li's words. Well, let me see how you are going to solve it. Su Li loosened her palm, and the black cloth immediately fell down, revealing the corpse. Black Lotus Ring could do whatever it wanted. Almost instantly, the suction force of Black Lotus Ring increased countless times, but it only acted on the corpse, and Su Li was not affected. Then Su Li saw that the man's body seemed to be shattered by a huge force and turned into a thick purple blood mist, which was all absorbed by Black Lotus Ring. After a few breaths, there was only a pile of white powder left on the ground, and Su Li waved her hand to disperse it. Except for the black robe, there was nothing to prove that the blood practitioner had ever existed. Su Li was surprised by the means of Black Lotus Ring, and suddenly her ring finger was hot. When she looked down, she saw that the originally dark Black Lotus Ring had become blood red at the moment, and a tear-shaped blood-red crystal was slowly growing in the center of the lotus mark. When the blood-red crystal grew to the size of a fist, the heat of Black Lotus Ring faded. Su Li took off the blood-red crystal in surprise and doubt and looked at it carefully. I have never seen such pure blood essence that is condensed to the extreme. How powerful will it be if it is refined into forging blood elixir? Su Li's eyes were shining. Under the quenching of the starlight of reincarnation mirror, her physical strength in this life was far greater than that of the same period in her previous life. Although her cultivation was still in Lianqi realm at the moment, she was not worse than any monster at the peak of Zhuji realm in terms of strength and physical body. My physical body has been promoted to the bottleneck. It is not difficult to refine forging blood elixir, and the auxiliary medicine is simple and easy to get. Only the blood-melting grass is difficult to find. When my cultivation is restored, I can leave Huajian Sect to find it. Thinking of this, Su Li also put the black robe on the ground into the universe bag, cleaned the cabin, and then returned to her previous residence with Jin Ing. Seeing that Jin Ing would not wake up in a short time, Su Li sat on the edge of her bed, took out the universe bag she got before, and explored it with her psychic awareness. A small space of less than 10 square meters appeared in her awareness sea. The man was obviously a casual practitioner. The things in the space were piled up in a corner in 2s and 3s. Su Li glanced at them. Except for 500 low-grade spiritual stones and a dozen middle-grade spiritual stones, she did not find any particularly valuable treasures. Most of them were refined blood. As soon as Su Li touched them, she knew that they were all the blood of babies, which was harmful to nature. She frowned slightly and shook her head with a wry smile. Compared to what she had done in the illusory realm, this was nothing. Although everything in the illusory realm was fake, her memories were not fake. The righteous ideals that she had always adhered to had long been completely destroyed in the illusory realm. The only thing that was left was her conscience as a human. Su Li took out all the blood and burned them one by one. After chanting the sutra to eliminate the resentment, most of the things in the universe bag were empty. There were only some inferior healing elixirs left. Su Li lost interest after a glance at them. As long as there were herbs, she could refine them at will. Seeing that it was almost dawn, Su Li's psychic awareness was about to withdraw from the universe bag to practice for a while. Her eyes inadvertently glanced at her wrist, and the psychic awareness that was about to withdraw stopped immediately. The ring of reincarnation mirror was trembling. However, the trembling was too small. If she hadn't taken a look, she wouldn't have noticed it at all. Is there something in the universe bag that caused it to react? Su Li hesitated for a moment, took off the mirror ring, and slowly stuck it on the universe bag. In her previous life, reincarnation mirror was the oldest treasure in the world. Not to mention the universe bag, even the more advanced universe ring couldn't contain it. But now, Su Li only saw a flash of light, and the mirror ring disappeared instantly and appeared in the spiritual stones that she had not yet withdrawn from the universe bag. It's so weak. What happened 1,000 years ago? Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. Before she could think about it, there was a new change in the universe bag. In the universe bag, the The ring of reincarnation mirror floated in the nothingness and trembled slightly. Wisps of dust were drawn from the pile of debris and injected into it. This dust, Su Li's psychic awareness intercepted a section and observed it carefully. But it was just ordinary dust. Why could the ring of reincarnation mirror absorb it? Could it be? Su Li thought for a moment and had a guess. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.